can twist the ratios around as it pleases? Oh, the prosecutor's bread is bitter. After all, they decided to publish every last word. That meant that engineers would read it too. "You've made your bed, now lie on it." And Krylenko rushed in fearlessly to discuss and to question and cross-question engineering details. And the inside pages and inserts of the enormous newspapers were full of small print about fine technical points. The notion was that every reader would be overcome by the sheer mass of material, that he wouldn't have enough time, even if he used up all his evenings and his rest days, too, and so he wouldn't read it all, but would only notice the refrain following every few paragraphs. "We were wreckers, wreckers, wreckers." But suppose someone did begin and read every last line. In that case, he would come to see, through the banality of self-accusations, composed with such ineptitude and stupidity, that the Lubyanka boa constrictor had gotten involved in something outside its competence, its own kind of work, that what breaks free of the crude noose is the strong-winged thought of the 20th century. There the prisoners are, in the dock, submissive, repressed, but their thought leaps out. Even their terrified, tired tongues manage to name everything with its proper name and to tell us everything. Here is the situation in which they worked. Kalinikov. Well, to be sure, a situation of technical distrust was created. Larichev. Whether we wanted to or not, we still had to produce that 42 millions of tons of petroleum. That is, it had been thus ordered from on high, because no matter what, 42 million tons of petroleum could not have been produced under any circumstances whatever. All the work of that unhappy generation of our engineers was squeezed between two such impossibilities. The Thermal Engineering Institute was proud of its principal research achievement, which was the sharply improved coefficient of fuel consumption. On this basis, lower requirements for fuel production had been stipulated in the preliminary plan. And that meant wrecking, reducing fuel resources. In the transportation plan, they had provided for all freight cars to be equipped with automatic coupling, and that meant wrecking. They had tied up capital funds. After all, it takes a long time to introduce automatic coupling, and the capital investment involved in installing it can only be recouped over a long period, and we want everything immediately. In order to make more efficient use of single-track railroads, they decided to increase the size of the locomotives and freight cars. And was that considered modernization? No, it was wrecking, because in that case it would have been necessary to invest funds in strengthening the road beds and the superstructures of the bridges. From the profound economic consideration that in America capital is cheap and labor dear, and that the situation here is just the opposite, and that we therefore ought not to borrow things with monkey-like imitativeness, Fedotov concluded that it was useless for us to purchase expensive American assembly line machinery. For the next 10 years, it would be more profitable for us to buy less sophisticated English machinery and to put more workers on it, since it was inevitable that in 10 years' time whatever we had purchased would be replaced anyway, no matter what. And we could then buy more expensive machinery. So that, too, was wrecking. Alleging economy as his reason, what he really wanted, they charged, was to avoid having the most advanced type of machinery in Soviet industry. They began to build new factories out of reinforced concrete, instead of cheaper, ordinary concrete, on the grounds that over a 100-year period reinforced concrete would recoup the additional investment many times over. So that, too, was wrecking, tying up capital, using up scarce reinforcing rods when iron was in short supply. What was it supposed to be kept for? False teeth? From among the defendants, Fedotov willingly conceded, "Of course, if every kopeck must be counted today, then it could be considered wrecking. The English say, 'I'm not rich enough to buy cheap goods.'" He tries softly to explain to the hard-headed prosecutor, "Theoretical approaches of every kind of project norms, which in the final analysis are, they will be considered to be, wrecking." Well, tell me now, how much more clearly could a frightened defendant speak out? What is theory to us is wrecking to you, because you are compelled to grab today without any thought for tomorrow. Old Fedotov tries to explain where thousands and millions of rubles are lost in the insane rush of the 5-year plan. Cotton is not sorted where it is grown, so that every factory can be sent that grade and kind of cotton it requires. Instead, it is shipped any old way, all mixed up. But the prosecutor doesn't listen to him. With the stubbornness of a block of stone, he keeps coming back again and again, 10 times, to the more obvious question he has put together out of children's building blocks. Why did they begin to build the so-called factory palaces with high ceilings, broad corridors, and unnecessarily good ventilation? Was that not the most obvious sort of wrecking? After all, that amounted to tying up capital irrevocably. The bourgeois wreckers explained to him that the People's Commissariat of Labor wanted to build factories for the workers in the land of the proletariat which were spacious and had good air. That means there are also wreckers in the People's Commissariat of Labor. Make a note of that. The doctors had insisted on 30 feet of space between floors, and Fedotov reduced it to 20. So why not to 16? Now that was wrecking. If he had reduced it to 15, that would have been flagrant wrecking. He would have wanted to create the nightmare conditions of a capitalist factory for free Soviet workers. They explained, Krylenko, that in relation to the entire cost of the factory and its equipment, this difference accounted for 3% of the total. But no, again and again and again, he keeps on about the height of the ceilings. And how did they dare install such powerful ventilators? They took into account the hottest summer days. Why the hottest days? So what? Let the workers sweat a little on the hottest days. And in the meantime, the disproportions were inherent. Bungling organizations sorted that before there was any engineers' center, Charnovsky. No wrecking activities were ever necessary. All one had to do was carry out the appropriate actions, and everything would happen on its own. Charnovsky again. He could not have expressed himself more clearly, and he said this after many months in the Lubyanka and from the defendant's bench in court. The appropriate actions, that is, those imposed by bungling higher-ups, were quite enough. Carry them out, and the unthinkable plan would destroy itself. Here was their kind of wrecking. We had the capability of producing, say, 1,000 tons, and we were ordered, in other words, by a nonsensical plan, to produce 3,000, so we took no steps to produce them. You must admit that for an official, double-checked, spruced-up stenographic record in those years, this is not so little. On many occasions, Krylenko drives his actors to tones of exhaustion, thanks to the nonsense they are compelled to grind out over and over again, like a bad play in which the actor is ashamed for the dramatist, and yet has to go on and on anyway to keep body and soul together. Krylenko, do you agree? Fedotov, I agree, even though in general I do not think... Krylenko, do you confirm this? Fedotov, properly speaking, in certain portions, and so to speak in general, yes. For the engineers, those who were still free, not yet imprisoned, and who had to face the necessity of working cheerfully after the defamation at the trial of their whole class, there was no way out. They were damned if they did, and damned if they didn't. If they went forward, it was wrong, and if they went backward, it was wrong, too. If they hurried, they were hurrying for the purpose of wrecking. If they moved methodically, it meant wrecking by slowing down tempos. If they were painstaking in developing some branch of industry, it was intentional delay, sabotage. And if they indulged in capricious leaps, their intention was to produce an imbalance for the purpose of wrecking. Using capital for repairs, improvements, or capital readiness was tying up capital funds, and if they allowed equipment to be used until it broke down, it was a diversionary action. In addition, the interrogators would get all this information out of them by subjecting them to sleeplessness and punishment cells, and then demanding that they give convincing examples of how they might have carried on wrecking activities. Give us a clear example. Give us a clear example of your wrecking activity, the impatient Krylenko urges them on. They will give you outstanding examples. Just wait. Soon someone will write the history of the technology of those years. He will give you examples, and negative examples. He will evaluate for you all the convulsions of your epileptic 5-year plan in 4 years. Then we will find out how much of the people's wealth and strength was squandered. Then we will find out how all the best projects were destroyed, and how the worst projects were carried out by the worst means. Well, yes. If the Mao Tse-tung breed of Red Guard youths supervise brilliant engineers, what good can come of it? Dilettante enthusiasts, they were the ones who egged on their even stupider leaders. Yes, full details are a disservice. Somehow the more details provided, the less the evil deeds seem to smell of execution. But just a moment. We've not had everything yet. The most important crimes all lie ahead. Here they are. Here they come, comprehensible and intelligible to every illiterate. The Plum Party, 1, prepared the way for the intervention. 2, took money from the imperialists. 3, conducted espionage. 4, assigned cabinet posts in a future government. And that did it. All mouths were shut, and all those who had been expressing their reservations fell silent, and only the tramping of demonstrators could be heard, and the roars outside the window. Death! 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 What about some more details? Why should you want more details? Well, then, if that's the way you want it. But they will only be more frightening. They were all acting under orders from the French General Staff. After all, France doesn't have enough worries or difficulties or party conflicts of its own, and it is enough just to whistle, and lo and behold, divisions will march. Intervention. First they planned it for 1928, but they couldn't come to an agreement. They couldn't tie up all the loose ends. All right, so they postponed it to 1930. But once more, they couldn't agree among themselves. All right, 1931 then. And as a matter of fact, here's how it was to go. France herself would not fight, but as her commission for organizing the deal, would take the Ukraine right bank as her share.
This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 4, Side 1. France herself would not fight, but as her commission for organizing the deal, would take the Ukraine right bank as her share.
England wouldn't fight either, of course, but in order to raise a scare, promised to send her fleet into the Black Sea and into the Baltic. In return, she would get Caucasian oil. The actual warriors would, for the most part, be the following. 100,000 émigrés. True, they had long since scattered to the four winds, but it would take only a whistle to gather them all together again immediately. Poland, for which she would get half the Ukraine. Romania, whose brilliant successes in World War I were famous. She was a formidable enemy. And then there were Latvia and Estonia. These two small countries would willingly drop all the concerns of their young governments and rush forth en masse to do battle. And the most frightening thing of all was the direction of the main blow. How's that? Was it already known? Yes. It would begin from Bessarabia, and from there, keeping to the right bank of the Dnieper, it would move straight on Moscow. Who drew that arrow for Krylenko on a cigarette pack? Was it not drawn by the same hand that thought up our entire defense strategy in 1941? And at that fateful moment, would not all our railroads certainly be blown up? No, not at all. Bottlenecks would be created. And the Plum Party would also yank out the fuses in electric power stations, and the entire Soviet Union would be plunged into darkness, and all our machinery would come to a halt, including the textile machinery. And sabotage would be carried out. Attention, defendants, you must not name your methods of sabotage, nor the factories which were your objectives, nor the geographic sites involved, until the closed session. and you must not name names, whether foreign or our own. Combine all this with the fatal blow which will have been dealt the textile industry by that time. Add the fact that the saboteurs will have constructed 2 or 3 textile factories in Byelorussia, which will serve as a base of operations for the interventionists. This was not intended as a joke. With the textile factories already in their hands, the interventionists would march implacably on Moscow. But here was the cleverest part of the whole plot. Though they didn't succeed in doing so, they had wanted to drain the Kuban marshes and the Polisai swamps and the swamp near Lake Ilmen. Vyshinsky had forbidden them to name the exact places, but one of the witnesses blurted them out. And then the interventionists would open up the shortest routes and would get to Moscow without wetting their feet or their horses' hoofs. And why was it so hard for the Tatars? Why was it that Napoleon didn't reach Moscow? Yes, it was because of the Polisai and the Ilmen swamps. And once those swamps were drained, the capital would lie exposed. On top of that, don't forget to add that hangars had been built there under the guise of sawmills, places not to be named, so that the planes of the interventionists would not get wet in the rain and could be taxied into them. And housing for the interventionists had also been built. Do not name the places. And where had all the homeless occupation armies been quartered in previous wars? The defendants had received all the directives on these matters from the mysterious foreign gentlemen, K and R. It is strictly forbidden to name their names or to name the countries they come from. And most recently they had even begun the preparation of treasonable actions by individual units of the Red Army. Do not name the branches of the service, nor the units, nor the names of any persons involved. True, they hadn't done any of this, but they had also intended, though they hadn't done that either, to organize within some central army institution a cell of financiers and former officers of the White Armies. Ah, the White Army. Write it down. Start making arrests. And cells of anti-Soviet students. Students. Write it down. Start making arrests. Incidentally, don't push things too far. We wouldn't want the workers to get despondent and begin to feel that everything is falling apart, that the Soviet government has been caught napping. And so they also threw a good deal of light on that side of it, that they had intended to do a lot and had accomplished very little, that not one industry had suffered serious losses. But why didn't the intervention take place anyway? For various complex reasons. Either because Poincaré hadn't been elected in France, or else because our émigré industrialists decided that their former enterprises had not yet been sufficiently restored by the Bolsheviks. Let the Bolsheviks do more. And then, too, they couldn't seem to come to terms with Poland and Romania. So, all right, there hadn't been any intervention, but there was at least a prom party. Do you hear the tramp of marching feet? Do you hear the murmur of the working masses? Death, death, death. And the marchers were those who in the event of war would have to atone with their deaths and deprivations and sufferings for the work of these men. And it was as if he had looked into a crystal ball. It was indeed with their deaths and deprivations and sufferings that those trusting demonstrators would atone in 1941 for the work of these men. But where is your finger pointing, prosecutor? At whom is your finger pointing? So then, why was it the industrial party? Why a party and not an engineering technical center? We are accustomed to having a center. Yes, there was a center too, but they had decided to reorganize themselves into a party. It was more respectable. That way it would be easier to fight over cabinet posts in the future government. It would mobilize the engineering technical masses for the struggle for power. And whom would they be struggling against? Other parties, of course, against the Working Peasants' Party, the TKP, in the first place, for after all they had 200,000 members, against the Menshevik Party in the second place. And as for a center, those three parties together were to have constituted a united center, but the GPU had destroyed them. And it's a good thing they destroyed us. All the defendants were glad. And it was flattering to Stalin to annihilate three more parties, would there have been any glory indeed in merely adding another 3 centers to his list. And having a party instead of a center meant having another central committee. Yes, the prom party's own central committee. True, there had not been any party conferences, nor had there been any elections, not even one. Whoever wanted to be on the central committee just joined up. 5 people, all told. They all made way for one another, and they all yielded the post of chairman to one another, too. There were no meetings, either of the central committee. No one else would remember this, but Ramzin would remember it very well indeed, and he would name names. Or of the groups from various branches of industry. There seemed even to be some dearth of members. As Charnovsky said, there never was any formal organization of a prom party. And how many members had there been? Larichev. A count of members would have been difficult. The exact composition was unknown. And how had they carried out their wrecking? How had directives been communicated? Well, it was just a matter of whoever met whomever in some particular institution. Directives were passed on orally. From then on, everyone would carry out his own wrecking on his own conscience. Well, now, Ramzin confidently named 2,000 members. And whenever he named 2, they arrested 5. According to the documents in the trial, there were altogether 30,000 to 40,000 engineers throughout the USSR. That meant they would arrest every 7th one and terrify the other 6. And what about contacts with the Working Peasants' Party? Well, they might meet in the State Planning Commission or else in the Supreme Council of the Economy and plan systematic acts against village communists. Where have we seen all this before? Aha! In Aida. They are seeing Radames off on his campaign, and the orchestra is thundering, and 8 warriors are standing there in helmets and with spears, and 2,000 more are painted on the backdrop. That's your prom party. But that's all right. It works. The show goes on. Today it is quite impossible to believe just how threatening and serious it all looked at the time. And it is hammered in by repetition, and every individual episode is gone over several times, and because of this the awful visions multiply. And in addition, so that things won't become too bland, the defendants suddenly forget something terribly unimportant, or else they try to renounce testimony, and right then and there they pin them down with cross-questioning. And it all winds up being as lively as the Moscow Art Theater. But Krylenko pressed too hard. On the one hand, he planned to disembowel the prom party, to disclose its social basis. That was a question of class, and his analysis couldn't go wrong. But Krylenko abandoned the Stanislavski method, didn't assign the roles, relied on improvisation. He let everyone tell his own story of his own life and what his relationship to the revolution had been, and how he was led to participate in wrecking. And in one fell swoop, that thoughtless insertion, that human picture, spoiled all 5 acts. The first thing that we learned, to our astonishment, is that all 8 of these big shots of the bourgeois intelligentsia came from poor families. The son of a peasant, one of the many children of a clerk, the son of an artisan, the son of a rural schoolteacher, the son of a peddler. At school they were all impoverished and earned the money for their education themselves, from the ages of 12, 13, and 14. Some gave lessons, and some worked on locomotives. And here was what was monstrous. No one barred their way to an education. They all completed the courses in high school and in higher technological institutions, and they became important and famous professors. How could that have been? They always told us that under Tsarism only the children of landowners and capitalists. Those calendars certainly couldn't have been lying. And here and now, in the Soviet period, engineers were in a very difficult position. It was almost impossible for them to provide their children with a higher education. After all, the children of the intelligentsia had the lowest priority, remember? The court didn't argue, nor did Krylenko. And the defendants themselves hastened to qualify what they had said, asserting that, against the background of the general and overall victories, this, of course, was unimportant. Here we begin to distinguish bit by bit among the defendants, who up to this point had talked very much like one another. Their age differential also divided them with respect to probity. Those close to 60 and older made statements that aroused a friendly, sympathetic reaction. But 43-year-old Ramzin and Larichev and 39-year-old Ochkin, the same one who had denounced Glabtop, the main fuels committee, in 1921, were glib and shameless. And all the major testimony about the Front Party and intervention comes from them. Ramzin was the kind of person, as a result of his early and extraordinary successes, who was shunned by the entire engineering profession, and he endured it. At the trial, he caught Krylenko's hints on the wing and volunteered precise statements. All the charges were founded on Ramzin's recollections. He possessed such self-control and force that he might very well have conducted plenipotentiary talks in Paris about intervention, on assignment from the GPU, obviously. Ochkin, too, was a fast climber. At 29, he had already possessed the unlimited trust of the Council of Labor and Defense and the Council of People's Commissars. One couldn't say the same about 62-year-old Professor Charnovsky. Anonymous students had persecuted him in the wall newspapers. After 23 years of lecturing, he had been summoned to a general students' meeting to give an account of his work. He hadn't gone. And in 1921, Professor Kalinikov had headed an open struggle against the Soviet government, specifically a professor's strike. What it amounted to was this. Back in the days of the Stolypin repression, the Moscow Higher Technical School had won academic autonomy, including the right to fill important posts, elect a rector, etc. In 1921, the professors in this school had re-elected Kalinikov to a new term as rector, but the People's Commissariat didn't want him there and had designated its own candidate. However, the professors went on strike and were supported by the students. At that time, there were no truly proletarian students, and Kalinikov was rector for a whole year despite the wishes of the Soviet government. It was only in 1922 that they had wrung the neck of that autonomy, and even then, in all probability, not without arrests. Fedotov was 66 years old, and he had been a factory engineer 11 years longer than the whole lifespan of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, from which the Soviet Communist Party had sprung. He had worked at all the spinning mills and textile factories in Russia. How hateful such people are, and how desirable it is to get rid of them as quickly as possible. In 1905, he had left his position as the director of the Morozov textile firm and the high salary which went with it, because he preferred to attend the red funerals which followed the caskets of the workers killed by the Cossacks. And now he was ill, had poor eyesight, and was too weak to leave home at night, even to go to the theater. And such people organized intervention and economic ruin. Charnovsky had not had any free evenings for many years because he had been so busy with his teaching and with developing new sciences, such as the science of the organization of production and the scientific principles of rationalization. I recall from my own childhood the engineering professors of those years, and that's exactly what they were like. Their evenings were given up to their students at all levels, and they didn't get home to their families until 11 p.m. After all, at the beginning of the 5-year plan, there were only 30,000 of them for the whole country. They were all strained to the breaking point. And it was these people who were supposed to have contrived a crisis, to have spied in exchange for handouts. Ramzin uttered just one honest phrase during the whole trial. The path of wrecking is alien to the inner structure of engineering. Throughout the trial, Krylenko forced the defendants to concede apologetically that they were scarcely conversant with, or were illiterate in, politics. After all, politics is much more difficult and much loftier than some kind of metallurgy or turbine design. In politics, your head won't help you, nor will your education. Come on, answer me. What was your attitude toward the October Revolution when it happened? Skeptical. In other words, immediately hostile. Why? Krylenko hounded them with his theoretical questions, and as a result of simple human slips of the tongue inconsistent with their assigned roles, the nucleus of the truth is disclosed to us, as to what really had taken place and from what the entire bubble had been blown. What the engineers had first seen in the October coup d'etat was ruin, and for 3 years there had truly been ruin and nothing else. Beyond that, they had seen the loss of even the most elementary freedoms, and these freedoms never returned. How then could engineers not have wanted a democratic republic? How could engineers accept the dictatorship of the workers, the dictatorship of their subordinates in industry, so little skilled or trained and comprehending neither the physical nor the economic laws of production, but now occupying the top positions, from which they supervised the engineers? Why shouldn't the engineers have considered it more natural for the structure of society to be headed by those who could intelligently direct its activity? And, excepting only the question of the moral leadership of society, is not this precisely where all social cybernetics is leading today? Is it not true that professional politicians are boils on the neck of society that prevent it from turning its head and moving its arms? And why shouldn't engineers have political views? After all, politics is not even a science, but is an empirical area not susceptible to description by any mathematical apparatus. Furthermore, it is an area subject to human egotism and blind passion. Even in the trial, Charnovsky speaks out. Politics must, nonetheless, be guided to some degree by the findings of technology. The wild pressures of war communism could only sicken the engineers. An engineer cannot participate in irrationality, and until 1920 the majority of them did nothing, even though they were barbarically impoverished. When NEP, the new economic policy, got underway, the engineers willingly went back to work. They accepted NEP as an indication that the government had come to its senses. But alas, conditions were not what they had been. The engineers were looked on as a socially suspicious element that did not even have the right to provide an education for its own children. Engineers were paid immeasurably low salaries in proportion to their contribution to production. But while their superiors demanded successes in production from them and discipline, they were deprived of the authority to impose this discipline. Any worker could not only refuse to carry out the instructions of an engineer, but could insult and even strike him and go unpunished. And as a representative of the ruling class, the worker was always right in such a case. Krylenko objects. Do you remember the Oldenburger trial? In other words, how we, so to speak, defended him. Fedotov. Yes, he had to lose his life in order to attract some attention to the predicament of the engineer. Krylenko, disappointed. Well, that was not how the matter was put. Fedotov. He died, and he was not the only one to die. He died voluntarily, and many others were killed. Krylenko was silent. That meant it was true. Leaf through the Oldenburger trial again and just imagine the persecution. And with the additional final line, many others were killed. So it was that the engineer was to blame for everything, even when he had done nothing wrong. But if he actually had made a real mistake, and after all he was a human being, he would be torn to pieces unless his colleagues could manage to cover things up. For would they value honesty? So the engineers then were forced at times to lie to the party leadership. To restore their authority and prestige, the engineers really had to unite among themselves and help each other out. They were all in danger, but they didn't need any kind of conference, any membership cards to achieve such unity. Like every kind of mutual understanding between intelligent and clear-thinking people, it was attained by a few quiet, even accidental words. No kind of voting was called for. Only narrow minds need resolutions and the party stick. And this was something Stalin could never understand, nor could the interrogators, nor their whole crowd. They had never had any experience of human relationships of that kind. They had never seen anything like that in party history. In any case, that sort of unity had long existed among Russian engineers in their big, illiterate nation of petty tyrants. It had already been tested for several decades. But now a new government had discovered it and become alarmed. Then came 1927, and the rationality of the NEP period went up in smoke, and it turned out that the entire NEP was merely a cynical deceit. Extravagantly unrealistic projections of a super-industrial forward leap had been announced. Impossible plans and tasks had been assigned. In those conditions, what was there for the collective engineering intelligence to do? The engineering leadership of the State Planning Commission and the Supreme Council of the Economy. To submit to insanity, to stay on the sidelines. It would have cost them nothing. One can write any figures one pleases on a piece of paper, but our comrades, our colleagues in actual production, will not be able to fulfill these assignments. And that meant it was necessary to try to introduce some moderation into these plans, to bring them under the control of reason, to eliminate entirely the most outrageous assignments. To create, so to speak, their own State Planning Commission of Engineers in order to correct the stupidities of the leaders. And the most amusing thing was that this was in their interests, the interests of the leaders, too, and in the interests of all industry and of all the people, since ruinous decisions could be avoided and squandered, scattered millions could be picked up from the ground. To defend quality, the heart of technology, amid the general uproar about quantity, planning, and over-planning, and to indoctrinate students with this spirit. That's what it was, the thin, delicate fabric of the truth. That is what it really was. But to utter such thoughts aloud in 1930 meant being shot, and yet it was still too little and too invisible to arouse the wrath of the mob. It was therefore necessary to reprocess the silent and redeeming collusion of the engineers into crude wrecking and intervention. Thus, in the picture they substituted, we nonetheless caught a fleshless and fruitless vision of the truth. The work of the stage director began to fall apart. Fedotov had already blurted out something about sleepless nights during the 8 months of his imprisonment, and about some important official of the GPU who had recently shaken his hand. So there must have been a deal. You play your roles, and the GPU will carry out its promises. And even the witnesses, though their role was incomparably less important, began to get confused. Krylenko: did you participate in this group? Witness Kirpotenko: 2 or 3 times when questions of intervention were being considered. And that was just what was needed. Krylenko, encouragingly: go on. Kirpotenko: a pause. Other than that, nothing is known. Krylenko urges him on, tries to give him his cue again. Kirpotenko, stupidly: other than intervention, nothing is known to me. Then, when there was an actual confrontation with Koprianov, the facts no longer jibed. Krylenko got angry, and he shouted at the inept prisoners: then you just have to fix things so you come up with the same answers. And in the recess, behind the scenes, everything was once more brought up to snuff. All the defendants were once again nervously awaiting their cues, and Krylenko prompted all 8 of them at once. The emigre industrialists had published an article abroad to the effect that they had held no talks at all with Ramzin and Larichev, and knew nothing whatever about any prom party, and that the testimony of the witnesses had in all likelihood been forced from them by torture. Well, what are you going to say to that? Good Lord, how outraged the defendants were! They clamored for the floor without waiting their turns. What had become of that weary calm with which they had humiliated themselves and their colleagues for 7 days? Boiling indignation at those emigres burst from them. They demanded permission to send a written declaration to the newspapers in defense of GPU methods. Now, wasn't that an embellishment? Wasn't that a jewel? And Ramzin declared, our presence here is sufficient proof that we were not subjected to tortures and torments. And what, pray tell, would be the use of tortures that made it impossible for the defendants to appear in court? And Fedotov: imprisonment did me good, and not only me. I even feel better in prison than in freedom. And Ochkin: me too. I feel better too. It was out of sheer generosity that Krylenko and Vyshinsky declined their offer of a collective declaration. They certainly would have written one, and they certainly would have signed it. But maybe someone had some lingering suspicions still. Well, in that case, Comrade Krylenko vouchsafed them a flash of his brilliant logic. If we should admit even for 1 second that these people were telling untruths, Then why were they arrested, and why did they all at once start babbling their heads off? Now that is the power of logic for you. For 1,000 years, prosecutors and accusers had never even imagined that the fact of arrest might in itself be a proof of guilt. If the defendants were innocent, then why had they been arrested? And once they had been arrested, that meant they were guilty. And indeed, why had they started babbling away? The question of torture we discard, but let us put the question psychologically. Why did they confess? And I ask you, what else could they have done? Well, how true, how psychological. If you ever served time in that institution, just recollect, what else was there to do? Ivanov Razumnik wrote that in 1938 he was imprisoned in the same cell in the Butyrki as Krylenko, and that Krylenko's place in the cell was under the board bunks. I can picture that vividly, since I have crawled there myself. The bunks were so low that the only way one could crawl along the dirty asphalt floor was flat on one's stomach, but newcomers could never adapt and would try to crawl on all fours. They would manage to get their heads under, but their rear ends would be left sticking out, and it is my opinion that the Supreme Prosecutor had a particularly difficult time adapting, and I imagine that his rear end, not yet grown thin, used to stick out there for the greater glory of Soviet justice. Sinful person that I am, I visualize with malice that rear end sticking out there, and through the whole long description of these trials, it somehow gives me solace. Yes, the prosecutor expounded, continuing along the same line, if all this about tortures was true, then it was impossible to understand what could have induced all the defendants to confess, unanimously and in chorus, without any arguments and deviations. Just where could such colossal collusion have been carried out? After all, they had no chance to communicate with each other during the interrogation period. Several pages further along, a witness who survived will tell us where. Now, it is not for me to tell the reader, but for the reader to tell me just what the notorious riddle of the Moscow trials of the 30s consisted of. At first, people were astounded at the Prom Party trial, and then that riddle was transferred to the trials of the party leaders. After all, they didn't put on trial in open court the 2,000 who had been dragged into it, or even 200 or 300, but only 8 people. It is not as hard as all that to direct a chorus of 8, and as for his choices, Krylenko was free to choose from thousands over a period of 2 years. Palchinsky had not been broken, but had been shot, and posthumously named the leader of the Prom Party, which is what he was called in the testimony, even though no word of his survived. And they had hoped to beat what they wanted out of Khrennikov, and Khrennikov didn't yield to them either. Therefore, he appeared just once in the record, in a footnote in small type. Khrennikov died during the course of his interrogation. The small type you are using is for fools, but we at least know, and we will write it in double-sized letters, tortured to death during interrogation. He, too, was posthumously named a leader of the Prom Party, but there wasn't one least little fact from him, not one tiny piece of testimony in the general chorus, not one. Because he did not give even one. And then all at once Ramzin appeared. He was a find. What energy and what a grasp. And he was ready to do anything in order to live. And what talent. He had been arrested only at the end of the summer, just before the trial, really, and he not only managed to enter fully into his role, but it seemed as though he had written the whole play. He had absorbed a whole mountain of interrelated material, and he could serve it up spick and span, any name at all, any fact at all, and sometimes he manifested the languid ornateness of a bigwig scientist. The activity of the Prom Party was so widespread that even in the course of an 11-day trial there is no opportunity to disclose it in total detail. In other words, go on and look for it, look further. I am firmly convinced that a small anti-Soviet stratum still exists in engineering circles. Go get 'em, grab some more. And how capable he was. He knew that it was a riddle, and that a riddle must be given an artistic explanation. And, unfeeling as a stick of wood, he found then and there within himself The traits of the Russian criminal for whom purification lay in public recantation before all the people. Ramzin has been undeservedly neglected in Russian memories. In my view, he fully deserved to become the prototype of a cynical and dazzling traitor, the Bengal fire of betrayal. He wasn't the only such villain of this epoch, but he was certainly a prominent case. So what it comes down to is that all Krylenko and the GPU had to do was select the right people. But the risk was small. Goods spoiled in interrogation could always be sent off to the grave, and whoever managed to get through both the frying pan and the fire could always be given medical treatment and be fattened up and put on public trial. So then, where is the riddle? How they were worked over? Very simply, do you want to live? And even those who don't care about themselves care about their children or grandchildren. Do you understand that it takes absolutely no effort to have you shot without your ever leaving the courtyards of the GPU? And there was no doubt whatever about that. Whoever hadn't yet learned it would be given a course in being ground down by the Lubyanka. But it is useful both for you and for us to have you act out a certain drama, the text for which you, as specialists, are going to write yourselves, and we, as prosecutors, are going to learn by heart, and we will try to remember the technical terms. Krylenko sometimes made mistakes during the trial. He said freight car axle instead of locomotive axle. It will be unpleasant to perform, and you will feel ashamed, but you just have to suffer through it. After all, it is better to live. And what assurance have we that you won't shoot us afterward? Why should we take vengeance on you? You are excellent specialists, and you have not committed any crimes, and we value you. Look at how many wrecking trials there have been. You'll see that no one who behaved has been shot. Mercy for the defendants who cooperated in one trial was an important prerequisite for the success of the next. And hope was transmitted via this chain right up to Zinoviev and Kamenev themselves. But the understanding is that you have to carry out all our conditions to the very last. The trial must work for the good of socialist society. And the defendants would fulfill all the conditions. Thus they served up all the subtlety of engineers' intellectual opposition as dirty wrecking on a level low enough to be comprehensible to the last illiterate in the country. But they had not yet descended to the level of ground glass in the food of the workers. The prosecutors had not yet thought that one up. A further theme was ideological motivation. Had they begun to wreck? It was the result of a hostile motivation, and now they jointly collaborated in confessing. It was once again the result of ideological motivation, for they had been converted, in prison, by the blazing blast-furnace face of the third year of the 5-year plan. Although in their last words they begged for their lives, that wasn't the main thing for them. Fedotov: "There is no forgiveness for us. The prosecutor is right." The main thing for these strange defendants right at that moment on the threshold of death was to convince the people and the whole world of the infallibility and far-sightedness of the Soviet government. Ramzin, in particular, glorified the revolutionary consciousness of the proletarian masses and their leaders, who had been able to find immeasurably more dependable paths of economic policy than the scientists, and who had calculated the tempos of economic growth rate far more correctly. And then, I had come to understand it was necessary to make a jump ahead, and that it was necessary to make a leap forward. And that is how they were talking here in the Soviet Union, in our own country, in 1930, when Mao Tse-tung was still a stripling. That it was necessary to capture by storm, etc., etc. And Larachev declared, "The Soviet Union is invincible against the weakening capitalist world." And Kalinikov, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is an inevitable necessity." And further, "The interests of the people and the interests of the Soviet government merge into one purposeful whole." Yes, and in addition, in the countryside, "The general line of the party, the destruction of the kulaks, is correct." They had time, while awaiting execution, to deliver themselves of judgments about everything, and the repenting intellectuals even had enough voice for such a prophecy as this. In proportion to the development of society, individual life is going to become more circumscribed. Collective will is the highest form. Thus it was that with 8-horse traction all the goals of the trial were attained. 1. All the shortages in the country, including famine, cold, lack of clothing, chaos, and obvious stupidities, were blamed on the engineer wreckers. 2. The people were terrified by the threat of imminent intervention from abroad and therefore prepared for new sacrifices. 3. Leftist circles in the West were warned of the intrigues of their governments. 4. The solidarity of the engineers was destroyed. All the intelligentsia was given a good scare and left divided within itself. And so that there should be no doubt about it, this purpose of the trial was once more clearly proclaimed by Ramzin. I would like to see that, in consequence of the present trial of the Prompt Party, the dark and shameful past of the entire intelligentsia will be buried once and for all. Larichev joined in. This caste must be destroyed. There is not and there cannot be loyalty among engineers. And Ochkin, too. The intelligentsia is some kind of mush. As the state accuser has said, it has no backbone, and this constitutes unconditional spinelessness. How immeasurably superior is the sensitivity of the proletariat. For some reason, the main thing about the proletariat is always, believe it or not, sensitivity. Always via the nostrils. So now, just why should such diligent collaborators be shot? And that was the way the history of our intelligentsia has been written for decades. From the anathema of 1920, the reader will remember, not the brains of the nation, but shit, and the ally of the black generals, and the hired agent of imperialism, right up to the anathema of 1930. So, should anyone be surprised that the word intelligentsia got established here in Russia as a term of abuse? That is how the public trials were manufactured. Stalin's searching mind had once and for all attained its ideal. Those blunderheads Hitler and Goebbels would come to envy it and rush into their shameful failure with the burning of the Reichstag. The standard had been set, and now it could be retained perennially and performed over again every season, according to the wishes of the chief producer. And in fact, the chief wanted another within 3 months. The rehearsal time was very short, but that was all right. Come and see the show. Only in our theater. A premiere. M. The case of the All-Union Bureau of the Mensheviks, March the 1st to the 9th, 1931. The case was heard by a special assize of the Supreme Court, the presiding judge in this case, for some reason, being N.M. Schwernik. Otherwise, everyone was in his proper place. Antonov Salatovsky, Krylenko, and his assistant Rodzinski. The producers were sure of themselves, for after all the subject wasn't technical, but was party material, ordinary stuff. So they brought 14 defendants onto the stage. And it all went off not just smoothly, but brilliantly. I was 12 at the time. For 3 years I had been attentively reading everything about politics on the enormous pages of Izvestia. I read the stenographic records of these 2 trials line by line. In the Prompt Party case I had already felt in my boyish heart superfluity, falsehood, fabrication. But at least there were spectacular stage sets, universal intervention, the paralysis of all industry, the distribution of ministerial portfolios. In the trial of the Mensheviks, all the same stage sets were brought out, but they were more pallid, and the actors spoke their lines without enthusiasm, and the whole performance was a yawning bore, an inept, tired repetition. Could it be that Stalin felt this, too, through his rhinoceros hide? How else can one explain his calling off the case of the Working Peasants' Party after it had already been prepared, or why there were no more trials for several years? It would be boring to base our interpretations once again on the stenographic record. In any case, I have fresher evidence from one of the principal defendants in this case, Mikhail Petrovich Yakubovich. At the present moment, his petition for rehabilitation, exposing all the dirty work which went on, has filtered through to Samizdat, our savior, and people are reading it just as it happened. He was refused rehabilitation. After all, the case in which he was tried had entered the golden tables of our history. After all, one cannot take back even one stone because the entire building might collapse. Thus it is that MPY still has his conviction on his record. However, for his consolation, he has been granted a personal pension for his revolutionary activity. What monstrosities exist in our country. His story offers material proof and explanation of the whole chain of Moscow trials of the 30s. How was the non-existent Union Bureau created? The GPU had been given an assignment. They had been told to prove that the Mensheviks had adroitly wormed their way into and seized many important government jobs for counter-revolutionary purposes. The genuine situation did not jibe with this plan. There were no real Mensheviks in important posts, but then there were no real Mensheviks on trial either. True, they say V.K. Ikov actually was a member of the quiet, do-nothing, illegal Moscow Bureau of the Mensheviks, but they didn't know that at the trial. He was processed in the second echelon and received a mere 8. The GPU had its own design. 2 from the Supreme Council of the Economy, 2 from the People's Commissariat of Trade, 2 from the State Bank, 1 from the Central Union of Consumer Cooperatives, 1 from the State Planning Commission. What a boring and unoriginal plan. Back in 1920, they had ordered in the matter of the Tactical Center that it include 2 from the Union of Rebirth, 2 from the Council of Public Figures, 2 from this and that, etc. Therefore, they picked the individuals who suited them on the basis of their positions, and whether they were Mensheviks or not depended on whether one believed rumors. Some who got caught this way were not Mensheviks at all, but directives had been given to consider them Mensheviks. The genuine political views of those accused did not interest the GPU in the least. Not all the defendants even knew each other, and they raked in Menshevik witnesses, too, wherever they could find them. One was Kuzma A. Gvozdev, a man whose fate was bitter. This was the same Gvozdev who had been chairman of the workers' group in the War Industry Committee, and whom the Tsarist government, in an excess of stupidity, had arrested in 1916, and the February Revolution had made Minister of Labor.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 4, Side 2.
Not all the defendants even knew each other, and they raked in Menshevik witnesses, too, wherever they could find them. One was Kuzma A. Gvozdev, a man whose fate was bitter. This was the same Gvozdev who had been chairman of the workers' group in the War Industry Committee, and whom the Tsarist government, in an excess of stupidity, had arrested in 1916, and the February Revolution had made Minister of Labor. Gvozdev became one of the martyr long-termers of Gulag. I do not know how many years he had been imprisoned before 1930, but from 1930 on he was in prison continuously, and my friends knew him in Spassk camp in Kazakhstan as late as 1952. All the witnesses, without exception, were later given prison terms too. Ramzin testified prolifically and obligingly at this trial also. But the GPU pinned its hopes on the principal defendant, Vladimir Gustavovich Groman, with the idea that he would help work up this case and be amnestied in return, and on the provocateur Petunin. I am basing all this on Yakubovich's report. Let us now introduce M.P. Yakubovich. He had begun his revolutionary activities so early that he had not even finished the gymnasium. In March 1917, he was already chairman of the Smolensk Soviet. Impelled by the strength of his convictions, which continued to lead him on, he became a strong and successful orator. At the Congress of the Western Front, he impetuously called those journalists who were demanding that the war continue enemies of the people. And this was in April 1917. He was nearly hauled from the rostrum, and he apologized, but thereafter in his speech he maneuvered so adroitly and so won over his listeners that at the end he called them enemies of the people again, and this time to stormy applause. He was elected to the delegation sent to the Petrograd Soviet, and hardly had he arrived there than, with the informality of those days, he was named to the military commission of the Petrograd Soviet. There he exerted a strong influence on the appointment of army commissars, and in the end he became an army commissar on the southwestern front and personally arrested Denikin in Vinitsa after the Kornilov revolt, and regretted very much indeed, during the trial as well, that he had not shot him on the spot. He is not to be confused with Colonel Yakubovich of the General Staff, who, at the same time and the same meetings, represented the War Ministry. Clear-eyed, always sincere, and always completely absorbed in his own ideas, whether they were right or wrong, he was counted as, and was, one of the younger members of the Menshevik Party. This did not prevent him, however, from presenting his own projects to the Menshevik leadership with boldness and passion, such as, in the spring of 1917, proposing the formation of a social democratic government, or in 1919 recommending that the Mensheviks enter the Comintern. Dan and the others invariably rejected all his plans and their variations, and quite condescendingly, for that matter. In July 1917, he was very pained by the action of the Socialist Petrograd Soviet in approving the provisional government's calling up army units for use against other socialists, considering it a fatal error even though the other socialists were using armed force. Hardly had the October coup taken place than Yakubovich proposed to his party that it should support the Bolsheviks wholeheartedly and work to improve the state structure they were creating. In the upshot, he was finally ostracized by Martov, and by 1920 he had left the ranks of the Mensheviks once and for all, convinced that he could not get them to follow the Bolsheviks' path. I have gone into all this detail to make it quite clear that throughout the revolution Yakubovich had been not a Menshevik, but a Bolshevik, and one who was entirely sincere and disinterested. In 1920, he was still one of the Smolensk food supply commissars, and the only one of them who was not a Bolshevik. He was even honored by the People's Commissariat of Food Supply as the best. He claims that he got along without reprisals against the peasantry, but I do not know whether or not this is true. At his trial, he did, however, recall that he had organized anti-speculation detachments. In the 1920s, he had edited the Torgovaya Gazeta, the trade gazette, and had occupied other important posts. He had been arrested in 1930 when just such Mensheviks as he, who had wormed their way in, were to be rounded up in accordance with the GPU plans. He had immediately been called in for questioning by Krylenko, who, earlier and always, as the reader already knows, was organizing the chaos of the preliminary inquiry into efficient interrogation. It turned out that they knew one another very well, for in the years between the first trials, Krylenko had gone to that very Smolensk province to improve food requisition work. And here is what Krylenko now said. "Mikhail Petrovich, I am going to talk to you frankly. I consider you a communist." His words encouraged Yakubovich and raised his spirits greatly. "I have no doubt of your innocence, but it is our party duty, yours and mine, to carry out this trial." Krylenko had gotten his orders from Stalin, and Yakubovich was all a-tremble for the sake of the cause, like a zealous horse rushing into the horse collar. "I beg you to help me in every possible way and to assist the interrogation, and in case of unforeseen difficulties during the trial, at the most difficult moments, I will ask the chairman of the court to give you the floor." And Yakubovich promised. Conscious of his duty, he promised. Indeed, the Soviet government had never before given him such a responsible assignment. And thus there was not the slightest need even to touch Yakubovich during the interrogation, but that was too subtle for the GPU. Like everyone else, Yakubovich was handed over to the butcher interrogators, and they gave him the full treatment, the freezing punishment cell, the hot box, beating his genitals. They tortured him so intensively that Yakubovich and his fellow defendant Abram Ginsburg opened their veins in desperation. After they had received medical attention, they were no longer tortured and beaten. Instead, the only thing to which they were subjected was 2 weeks of sleeplessness. Yakubovich says, "Just to be allowed to sleep, neither conscience nor honor matters any longer." and then they were confronted with others who had already given in and who urged them to confess to utter nonsense. And the interrogator himself, Alexei Alexeyevich Nasedkin, said, I know, none of this actually happened, but they insist on it. On one occasion, when Yakubovich had been summoned to interrogation, he found there a prisoner who had been tortured. The interrogator smiled ironically. Moisei Isaievich Teitelbaum begs you to take him into your anti-Soviet organization. You can speak as freely as you please. I am going out for a while. He went out. Teitelbaum really did beg. Comrade Yakubovich, I beg you, please take me into your Union Bureau of Mensheviks. They are accusing me of taking bribes from foreign firms and threatening me with execution. But I would rather die a counter-revolutionary than a common criminal. It was likelier that they had promised him that as a counter-revolutionary he wouldn't be shot. And he wasn't wrong, either. They gave him a juvenile prison term, a 5er. The GPU was so short on Mensheviks they had to recruit defendants from volunteers. And after all, Teitelbaum was being groomed for an important role, communication with the Mensheviks abroad and with the Second International. But they honorably kept the deal they had made with him, a 5er. And with the interrogator's approval, Yakubovich accepted Teitelbaum as a member of the Union Bureau. Several days before the trial began, the first organizing session of the Union Bureau of the Mensheviks convened in the office of the senior interrogator, Dmitry Matveyevich Dmitriev, so as to coordinate things and so that each should understand his own role better. That's how the Central Committee of the Prom Party convened, too. That's where the defendants could have met, to answer Krylenko's earlier leading question. But such a mountain of falsehood had been piled up that it was too much to absorb in one session, and the participants got things mixed up, couldn't master it in one rehearsal, and were called together a second time. What did Yakubovich feel as he went into the trial? Should he not, in revenge for all the tortures to which he had been subjected, for all the falsehood shoved into his breast, create a sensational scandal and startle the world? But still. 1. To do so would be to stab the Soviet government in the back. It would be to negate his entire purpose in life, everything he had lived for, the whole path he had taken to extricate himself from mistaken Menshevism and become a right-minded Bolshevik. 2. After a scandal like that, they wouldn't just allow him to die, they wouldn't just shoot him, they would torture him again, but this time out of vengeance, and drive him insane. But his body had already been exhausted by tortures. Where could he find the moral strength to endure new ones? Where could he unearth the required heroism? I wrote down his arguments as his heated words rang out, this being a most extraordinary chance to get, so to speak, a posthumous explanation from a participant in such a trial. And I find that it is altogether as though Bukharin or Rykov were explaining their reasons for their own mysterious submissiveness at their trials. Theirs were the same sincerity and honesty, the same devotion to the party, the same human weakness, the same lack of the moral strength needed to fight back, because they had no individual position. And at the trial, Yakubovich not only repeated obediently all the grey mass of lies which constituted the upper limit of Stalin's imagination, and the imagination of his apprentices and his tormented defendants, but he also played out his inspired role as he had promised Krylenko. The so-called foreign delegation of the Mensheviks, in essence the entire top level of their Central Committee, formally dissociated themselves from the defendants in a statement published in Vorwärts. They declared there that the trial was a shameful travesty built on the testimony of provocateurs and unfortunate defendants forced into it by terror, that the overwhelming majority of the defendants had left the party more than 10 years earlier and had never returned, and that absurdly large sums of money were referred to at the trial, representing more than the party had ever disposed of. And Krylenko, having read the article, asked Schwernik to permit the defendants to reply, the same kind of pulling all strings at once he had resorted to at the trial of the Prom Party. They all spoke up, and they all defended the methods of the GPU against the Menshevik Central Committee. But what does Yakubovich remember today about his reply and his last speech? He recalls that he not only spoke as befitted his promise to Krylenko, but that instead of simply getting to his feet, he was seized and lifted up, like a chip on a wave, by a surge of anger and oratory. Anger against whom? After having learned what torture meant, and attempting suicide and coming close to death more than once, he was at this point in a real, honest-to-God rage. But not at the prosecutor or the GPU. Oh, no. At the foreign delegation of the Mensheviks. Now, there's a psychological switch for you. There they sat, unscrupulous and smug, in security and comfort, for even the poverty of emigre life was, of course, comfort in comparison with the Lubyanka. And how could they refuse to pity those who were on trial, their torture and suffering? How could they so impudently dissociate themselves from them and deliver these unfortunates over to their fate? The reply Yakubovich delivered was powerful, and the people who had cooked up the trial were delighted. Even when he was describing this in 1967, Yakubovich shook with rage at the foreign delegation, at their betrayal, their repudiation, their treason to the socialist revolution, exactly as he had reproached them in 1917. I did not have the stenographic record of the trial at the time. Later I found it and was astonished. Yakubovich's memory, so precise in every little detail, every date, every name, had in this instance betrayed him. He had, after all, said at the trial that the foreign delegation, on orders from the Second International, had instructed them to carry out wrecking activities. He no longer remembered this. The foreign Menshevik statement was neither unscrupulous nor smug. They had indeed pitied the unfortunate victims of the trial, but did point out that they had not been Mensheviks for a long time, which was quite true. What was it, then, that made Yakubovich so unalterably and sincerely angry? And exactly how could the foreign delegation not have consigned the defendants to their fate? We like to take our anger out on those who are weaker, those who cannot answer. It is a human trait, and somehow the arguments to prove we are right appear out of nowhere. Krylenko said in his summation for the prosecution that Yakubovich was a fanatic advocate of counter-revolutionary ideas and demanded, therefore, that he be shot. And Yakubovich that day felt a tear of gratitude roll down his cheek, and he feels it still to this day, after having dragged his way through many camps and detention prisons. Even today he is grateful to Krylenko for not humiliating him, for not insulting him, for not ridiculing him as a defendant, and for calling him correctly a fanatic advocate, even of an idea contrary to his real one, and for demanding simple, noble execution for him that would put an end to all his sufferings. In his final statement, Yakubovich agreed with Krylenko himself. The crimes to which I have confessed, he endowed with great significance his success in hitting on the expression, to which I have confessed. Anyone who understood would realize that he meant not those which I committed. Deserve the highest measure of punishment, and I do not ask any forgiveness. I do not ask that my life be spared. Beside him on the defendant's bench, Groman got excited. You're insane. You have to consider your comrades. You don't have the right. Now, wasn't he a find for the prosecutor? And can one still say the trials of 1936 to 1938 are unexplained? Was it not through this trial that Stalin came to understand and believe that he could readily round up all his loud-mouthed enemies and get them organized for just such a performance as this? And may my compassionate reader now have mercy on me. Until now my pen sped on untrembling, my heart didn't skip a beat, and we slipped along unconcerned, because for these 15 years we have been firmly protected either by legal revolutionality or else by revolutionary legality. But from now on things will be painful, as the reader will recollect, as we have had explained to us dozens of times, beginning with Khrushchev. From approximately 1934, violations of Leninist norms of legality began. And how are we to enter this abyss of illegality now? How are we to drag our way along yet another bitter stretch of the road? However, these trials which follow were, because of the fame of the defendants, a cynosure for the whole world. They did not escape the attention of the public. They were written about. They were interpreted, and they will be interpreted again and again. It is for us merely to touch lightly on their riddle. Let us make one qualification, though not a big one. The published stenographic records did not coincide completely with what was said at the trials. One writer who received an entrance pass, they were given out only to selected individuals, took running notes and subsequently discovered these differences. All the correspondents also noted the snag with Krestinsky, which made a recess necessary in order to get him back on the track of his assigned testimony. Here is how I picture it. Before the trial, a chart was set up for emergencies. In the first column was the name of the defendant. In the second, the method to be used during the recess if he should depart from his text during the open trial. In the third column, the name of the chekist responsible for applying the indicated method. So, if Krestinsky departed from his text, then who would come on the run and what that person would do had already been arranged. But the inaccuracies of the stenographic record do not change or lighten the picture. Dumbfounded, the world watched 3 plays in a row, 3 wide-ranging and expensive dramatic productions, in which the powerful leaders of the fearless Communist Party, who had turned the entire world upside down and terrified it, now marched forth like doleful, obedient goats, and bleated out everything they had been ordered to, vomited all over themselves, cringingly abased themselves and their convictions, and confessed crimes they could not in any wise have committed. This was unprecedented in remembered history. It was particularly astonishing in contrast with the recent Leipzig trial of Dimitrov. Dimitrov had answered the Nazi judges like a roaring lion, and immediately afterward his comrades in Moscow, members of that same unyielding cohort which had made the whole world tremble, and the greatest of them at that, those who had been called the Leninist Guard, came before the judges drenched in their own urine. And even though much appears to have been clarified since then, with particular success by Arthur Koestler, the riddle continues to circulate as durably as ever. People have speculated about a Tibetan potion that deprives a man of his will, and about the use of hypnosis. Such explanations must by no means be rejected. If the NKVD possessed such methods, clearly there were no moral rules to prevent resorting to them. Why not weaken or muddle the will? And it is a known fact that in the 1920s some leading hypnotists gave up their careers and entered the service of the GPU. It is also reliably known that in the 1930s a school for hypnotists existed in the NKVD. Kamenev's wife was allowed to visit her husband before his trial and found him not himself, his reactions retarded, and she managed to communicate this to others before she herself was arrested. But why was neither Palchinsky nor Krennikov broken by the Tibetan potion or hypnosis? The fact is that an explanation on a higher psychological plane is called for. One misunderstanding in particular results from the image of these men as old revolutionaries who had not trembled in Tsarist dungeons, seasoned, tried and true, hardened, etc., fighters. But there is a plain and simple mistake here. These defendants were not those old revolutionaries. They had acquired that glory by inheritance from and association with the Narodniks, the SRs, and the anarchists. They were the ones, the bomb-throwers and the conspirators, who had known hard labor imprisonment and real prison terms, but even they had never in their lives experienced a genuinely merciless interrogation, because such a thing did not exist at all in Tsarist Russia. And these others, the Bolshevik defendants at the treason trials, had never known either interrogation or real prison terms. The Bolsheviks had never been sentenced to special dungeons, any Sakhalin, any special hard labor in Yakutsk. It is well known that Dzerzhinsky had the hardest time of them all, that he had spent all his life in prisons. But according to our yardstick, he had served just a normal tenner, just a simple 10-ruble bill, like any ordinary collective farmer in our time. True, included in that tenner were 3 years in the hard labor central prison, but that is nothing special either. The party leaders who were the defendants in the trials of 1936 to 1938 had, in their revolutionary pasts, known short, easy imprisonment, short periods in exile, and had never even had a whiff of hard labor. Bukharin had many petty arrests on his record, but they amounted to nothing. Apparently he was never imprisoned anywhere for a whole year at a time, and he had just a wee bit of exile on Onega. All the information here comes from Volume 41 of the Granat Encyclopedia, in which either autobiographical or reliable biographical essays on the leaders of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, are collected. Kamenev, despite long years of propaganda work and travel to all the cities of Russia, spent only 2 years in prison and 1.5 years in exile. In our time, even 16-year-old kids got 5 right off. Zinoviev, believe it or not, never spent as much as 3 months in prison. He never received even 1 sentence. In comparison with the ordinary natives of our archipelago, they were all callow youths. They didn't know what prison was like. Rykov and I.N. Smirnov had been arrested several times and had been imprisoned for 5 years. But somehow they went through prison very easily, and they either escaped from exile without any trouble at all, or were released because of an amnesty. Until they were arrested and imprisoned in the Lubyanka, they hadn't the slightest idea what a real prison was, nor what the jaws of unjust interrogation were like. There is no basis for assuming that if Trotsky had fallen into those jaws, he would have conducted himself with any less self-abasement, or that his resistance would have proved stronger than theirs. He had had no occasion to prove it. He, too, had known only easy imprisonment, no serious interrogations, and a mere 2 years of exile in Ust-Kut. The terror Trotsky inspired as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council was something he acquired very cheaply, and does not at all demonstrate any true strength of character or courage. Those who have condemned many others to be shot often wilt at the prospect of their own death. The two kinds of toughness are not connected. And as for Radek, he was a plain provocateur. And he wasn't the only one in these 3 trials. And Yagoda was an inveterate, habitual criminal. This murderer of millions simply could not imagine that his superior murderer, up top, would not at the last moment stand up for him and protect him. Just as though Stalin had been sitting right there in the hall, Yagoda confidently and insistently begged him directly for mercy. "I appeal to you. For you I built 2 great canals." And a witness reports that at just that moment a match flared in the shadows behind a window on the 2nd floor of the hall, apparently behind a muslin curtain, and while it lasted, the outline of a pipe could be seen. Whoever has been in Bakhchisarai may remember that oriental trick. The 2nd-floor windows in the Hall of Sessions of the State Council are covered with iron sheets pierced by small holes, and behind them is an unlit gallery. It is never possible to guess down in the hall itself whether someone is up there or not. The Khan remained invisible, and the council always met as if in his presence. Given Stalin's out-and-out oriental character, I can readily believe that he watched the comedies in that October hall. I cannot imagine that he would have denied himself this spectacle, this satisfaction. And, after all, our entire failure to understand derives from our belief in the unusual nature of these people. We do not, after all, where ordinary confessions signed by ordinary citizens are concerned, find their reasons for denouncing themselves and others so fulsomely baffling. We accept it as something we understand. A human being is weak. A human being gives in. But we consider Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Pyatukov, and Smirnov to be supermen to begin with, and in essence our failure to understand is due to that fact alone. True, the directors of this dramatic production seem to have had a harder task in selecting the performers than they'd had in the earlier trials of the engineers. In those trials they had 40 barrels to pick from, so to speak, whereas here the available troupe was small. Everyone knew who the chief performers were, and the audience wanted to see them in the roles, and them only. Yet there was a choice. The most far-sighted and determined of those who were doomed did not allow themselves to be arrested. They committed suicide first. Skripnik, Tomsky, Gamarnik. It was the ones who wanted to live who allowed themselves to be arrested, and one could certainly braid a rope from the ones who wanted to live. But even among them, some behaved differently during the interrogations, realized what was happening, turned stubborn, and died silently, but at least not shamefully. For some reason they did not, after all, put on public trial Rutsutak, Postishev, Yanokidze, Chubar, Kosior, and for that matter, Krylenko himself, even though their names would have embellished the trials. They put on trial the most compliant. A selection was made, after all. The men selected were drawn from a lower order, but on the other hand, the moustached producer knew each of them very well. He also knew that on the whole they were weaklings, and he knew one by one the particular weaknesses of each. Therein lay his dark and special talent, his main psychological bent and his life's achievement, to see people's weaknesses on the lowest plane of being. And the man who seems, in the perspective of time, to have embodied the highest and brightest intelligence of all the disgraced and executed leaders, and to whom Arthur Koestler apparently dedicated his talented inquiry, was N.I. Bukharin. Stalin saw through him, too, at that lowest stratum at which the human being unites with the earth, and Stalin held him in a long death grip, playing with him as a cat plays with a mouse, letting him go just a little, and then catching him again. Bukharin wrote every last word of our entire existing, in other words, non-existent, constitution, which is so beautiful to listen to. And he flew about up there, just below the clouds, and thought that he had outplayed Koba, that he had thrust a constitution on him that would compel him to relax the dictatorship. And at that very moment, he himself had already been caught in those jaws. Bukharin did not like Kamenev and Zinoviev, and way back when they had first been tried, after the murder of Kirov, he had said to people close to him, "Well, so what? That's the kind of people they were. Maybe there was something to it." That was the classic formula of the Philistine in those years. There was probably something to it. In our country, they don't arrest people for nothing. And that was said in 1935 by the leading theoretician of the party. He spent the period of the second trial of Kamenev and Zinoviev in the summer of 1936 hunting in the Tian Shan, and knew nothing about it. He came down from the mountains to Frunze, and there he read that the death sentence had been imposed on both men, and read the newspaper articles which made clear what annihilating testimony they had given against him. But did he hasten to stop that act of repression? And did he protest to the party that something monstrous was being done? No. All he did was send Koba a telegram asking him to postpone the execution of Kamenev and Zinoviev, so that he, Bukharin, could get there to confront them and prove himself innocent. It was too late. Koba had enough of the sworn testimony. Why did he need living confrontations? However, they still didn't arrest Bukharin for a long time. He lost his job as editor-in-chief of Izvestia and all his other party assignments and jobs, and he lived for half a year in his Kremlin apartment in the Poteshny Palace of Peter the Great, as if in prison. However, in the autumn he used to go to his dacha, and the Kremlin guards would salute him as though nothing at all had changed. No one visited him or phoned him any longer, and all during these months he wrote endless letters. "Dear Koba, dear Koba, dear Koba," and he got not one reply. He was still trying to establish friendly contact with Stalin. And dear Koba, squinting, was already staging rehearsals. For many long years, Koba had been holding tryouts for various roles, and he knew that Bukharchik would play his part beautifully. He had, after all, already renounced those of his pupils and supporters who had been arrested and exiled, they were few in number in any case, and had allowed them to be destroyed. The only one he defended was Yefim Tsaitlin, but not for long. He had stood by and allowed his own line of thinking to be wiped out and pilloried before it was fully developed and born, and more recently, while he was still editor-in-chief of Izvestia and a member of the Politburo, he had accepted as legal the execution of Kamenev and Zinoviev. Neither at the top of his lungs nor even in a whisper had he expressed any indignation over that, and yet these had all been tryouts for his own future role. Way back in the past, when Stalin had threatened to expel him, and all the rest of them, from the party, Bukharin, like all the rest, had renounced his views in order to remain in the party, and that, too, had been a tryout for his role. If that was how they acted while still in freedom and still at the height of honor and power, then they could certainly be depended on to follow the script of the play faultlessly, when their body, their food, and their sleep were in the hands of the Lubyanka prompters. And what did Bukharin fear most in those months before his arrest? It is reliably known that above all he feared expulsion from the party, being deprived of the party, being left alive but outside the party. And dear Koba had played magnificently on this trait of his, as he had with them all, from the very moment he had himself become the party. Bukharin, like all the rest of them, did not have his own individual point of view. They didn't have their own genuine ideology of opposition, on the strength of which they could step aside and on which they could take their stand. Before they became an opposition, Stalin declared them to be one, and by this move he rendered them powerless. And all their efforts were directed toward staying in the party, and toward not harming the party at the same time. These added up to too many different obligations for them to be independent. In essence, Bukharin had been allotted the starring role, and nothing was to be overlooked or abridged in the producer's work with him, in the working of time on him, and in his own getting used to the role. Even sending him to Europe the previous winter to acquire manuscripts by Marx had been essential, not just superficially for the sake of the whole network of accusations about his establishing contacts, but so that the aimless freedom of life on tour might all the more insistently demand his return to the main stage. And now, beneath black thunderclouds of accusations, came the long, the interminable state of non-arrest, of exhausting housebound lethargy, which ground down the willpower of the victim even more effectively than the direct pressure of the Lubyanka. Nor would the Lubyanka run away either. It, too, would last for a year.
On one occasion, Bukharin was summoned by Kaganovich, who arranged a confrontation between him and Sokolnikov in the presence of high-ranking Chekists.
Sokolnikov gave testimony about the parallel rightist center, parallel, in other words, to that of the Trotskyites, and about Bukharin's underground activity. Kaganovich conducted the interrogation aggressively, and then ordered Sokolnikov to be taken away. And he said to Bukharin in a friendly tone, "He lies in his teeth, the whore." Despite that, the newspapers continued to report the indignation of the masses. Bukharin telephoned the Central Committee. Bukharin wrote letters beginning, "Dear Koba," in which he begged that the accusations against him be publicly denied. And then the prosecutor's office published a roundabout declaration. "Objective proofs for the indictment of Bukharin have not been found." Radek telephoned him in the fall, wanting to see him. Bukharin shunned him. "We are both being accused. Why add another cloud?" But their Izvestia country houses were next to each other, and Radek dropped in on him one evening. "No matter what I may say later on, please know that I am not to blame for anything. And anyway, you will come out of it whole. You were not connected with the Trotskyites." And Bukharin believed he would come out of it whole, and that he would not be expelled from the party, for that would be monstrous. In actuality, he had always been hostile to the Trotskyites. They had put themselves outside the party, and look what had come of it. They had to stick together. Even if they made mistakes, they had to stick together on that, too. At the November demonstration, his farewell to Red Square, he and his wife went to the reviewing stand for guests on his newspaper editor's press card. All at once, an armed soldier came up to him. His heart stopped. They were going to do it here, at a time like this? No. The soldier saluted. "Comrade Stalin is surprised at your being here. He asks you to take your place on the mausoleum." And that's the way they tossed him back and forth, from hot to cold, for the entire half-year. On December the 5th, they adopted the Bukharin Constitution with fanfare and celebration, and named it the Stalinist Constitution for all eternity. At the December plenum of the Central Committee, they brought in Pyatakov, with his teeth knocked out, and not a bit like himself. Behind his back stood silent Chekists, Yagoda men, and Yagoda, after all, was also being tested and prepared for a role. Pyatakov delivered himself of the most repulsive sort of testimony against Bukharin and Rykov, both of whom were sitting right there among the leaders. Ordzhonikidze put his hand up to his ear. He was hard of hearing. "See here, are you giving all this testimony voluntarily?" "Note that down, or Ordzhonikidze will get a bullet of his own." "Absolutely voluntarily," and Pyatakov swayed on his feet. And during the recess, Rykov said to Bukharin, "Tomsky had willpower. He understood it all back in August, and he ended his own life, while you and I, like fools, have gone on living." At this point, Kaganovich made an angry, condemnatory speech. He wanted so much to believe in Bukhatchik's innocence, but he couldn't any longer. And then Molotov. And then Stalin. What a generous heart! What a memory for the good things! "Nonetheless, I consider that Bukharin's guilt has not yet been proven. Perhaps Rykov is guilty, but not Bukharin." Someone had drawn up charges against Bukharin, against his will. From cold to hot. That's how willpower collapses. That's how to grow used to the role of a ruined hero. And then they began to bring to his home, day after day, the records of interrogations, the depositions of young ex-students in the Institute of Red Professors, of Radek, and all the rest of them, and they all provided the gravest proofs of Bukharin's black treason. They took these documents to his home, not as if he were a defendant, oh, by no means, merely in his position as a member of the Central Committee, merely for his information. Usually, when he received a new batch of these materials, Bukharin would say to his 22-year-old wife, who only that spring had given him a son, "You read them, I can't," and he would bury his head in his pillow. He had 2 revolvers at home. Stalin was giving him time, too. And yet he did not commit suicide. Is it not clear that he had grown used to his ordained role? And one more public trial took place, and they shot one more batch of defendants. And yet they continued to be merciful to Bukharin. They had not taken Bukharin. At the beginning of February 1937, he decided to go on a hunger strike at home in order to force the Central Committee to hold a hearing and clear him of the charges against him. He announced it in a letter to Dear Koba, and he honestly went through with it, too. Then a plenum of the Central Committee was convened with the following agenda. 1. The crimes of the rightist centre. 2. The anti-party conduct of Comrade Bukharin as evidenced by his hunger strike. Bukharin hesitated. Had he perhaps really insulted the party in some particular way? Unshaven, thin, wan, already a prisoner in appearance, he dragged himself along to the plenum. "What on earth were you thinking of?" Dear Koba asked him cordially. "But what was I to do in the face of such accusations? They want to expel me from the party." Stalin made a wry face at the absurdity. "Come on now, no one is going to expel you from the party." Bukharin believed him and revived. He willingly assured the plenum of his repentance and immediately abandoned his hunger strike. At home he said, "Come on now, cut me some sausage. Koba said they wouldn't expel me." But in the course of the plenum, Kaganovich and Molotov, impudent fellows they were indeed, paid no attention to Stalin's opinion. See what a wealth of information we are deprived of because we're protecting Molotov's noble old age. Both called Bukharin a fascist hireling and demanded that he be shot. And once again Bukharin's spirits fell, and in his last days he began to compose his Letter to the Future Central Committee. Committed to memory and thereby preserved, it recently became known to the whole world. However, it did not shake the world to its foundations, nor did it shake the Future Central Committee either. For what were the last words this brilliant theoretician decided to hand down to future generations? Just one more cry of anguish and a plea to be restored to the party. He paid dearly in shame for that devotion. and one more affirmation that he fully approved everything that had happened up to and including 1937. And that included not only all the previous jeeringly mocking trials, but also all the foul-smelling waves of our great prison sewage disposal system. And that is how he himself certified that he, too, deserved to plunge into those waves. So, at long last, he had matured to the point of being turned over to the prompters and the assistant producers, this muscular man, this hunter and wrestler. In playful tussles in the presence of the Central Committee, how many times had he landed Stalin flat on his back? And this, too, was probably something Koba couldn't forgive him. And in the case of one so fully prepared, so demolished that no torture was called for, how was his position any stronger than that of Yakubovich in 1931? How could he not be susceptible to the same two arguments? He was, in fact, much weaker, because Yakubovich longed for death, and Bukharin dreaded it. There remained an easy dialogue with Vyshinsky along set lines. Is it true that every opposition to the party is a struggle against the party? In general, it is. Factually, it is. But a struggle against the party cannot help but grow into a war against the party. According to the logic of things, yes, it must. And that means that in the end, given the existence of oppositionist beliefs, any foul deeds whatever might be perpetrated against the party. Espionage, murder, sellout of the motherland. But wait a minute, none were actually committed. But they could have been, well, theoretically speaking. Those are your theoreticians for you. But for us, the highest of all interests are those of the party. Yes, of course, of course. So, you see, only a very fine distinction separates us. We are required to concretize the eventuality. In the interest of discrediting for the future any idea of opposition, we are required to accept as having taken place what could only theoretically have taken place. After all, it could have, couldn't it? It could have.
This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 5, Side 1.
We are required to concretize the eventuality. In the interest of discrediting for the future any idea of opposition, we are required to accept as having taken place what could only theoretically have taken place. After all, it could have, couldn't it? It could have. And so it is necessary to recognize as actual what was possible. That's all. It's a small philosophical transition. Are we in agreement? Yes, and one thing more. And it's not for me to explain to you, but if you retreat and say something different during the trial, you understand that it will only play into the hands of the world bourgeoisie and will only do the party harm. Well, and it's clear that in that case you yourself will not die an easy death. But if everything goes off all right, we will, of course, allow you to go on living. We'll send you in secret to the island of Monte Cristo, and you can work on the economics of socialism there. But in previous trials, as I understand it, you did shoot them all. But what comparison is there between you and them? And then we also left many of them alive, too. They were shot only in the newspapers. And so, perhaps, there isn't any insoluble riddle. It was all that same invincible theme song, persisting with only minor variations through so many different trials. After all, we and you are communists. How could you have gotten off the track and come out against us? Repent. After all, you and we together is us. Historical comprehension ripens slowly in a society, and when it does ripen, it is so simple. Neither in 1922, nor in 1924, nor in 1937 were the defendants able to hang on to their own point of view so firmly that they could raise their heads and shout in reply to that bewitching and anesthetizing melody, "No, we are not revolutionaries with you. No, we are not Russians with you. No, we are not communists with you." It would seem that if only that kind of shout had been raised, All the stage sets would have collapsed. The plaster masks would have fallen off. The producer would have fled down the back stairs, and the prompters would have sneaked off into their rat holes. And out of doors it would have been, say, 1967. But even the most superbly successful of these theatrical productions was expensive and troublesome, and Stalin decided not to use open trials any longer. Or, rather, in 1937, he probably did have a plan for holding public trials on a wide scale in the local districts, so the black soul of the opposition would be made visible to the masses. But he couldn't find producers who were good enough. It wasn't practical to prepare things so carefully, and the mental processes of the accused weren't so complex, and Stalin only got into a mess, although very few people know about it. The whole plan broke down after a few trials and was abandoned. It's appropriate here to describe one such trial, the Kadi case, detailed reports of which the Ivanovo provincial newspapers published initially. At the end of 1934, a new local administrative district was created in the remote wilds of Ivanovo province, at the point where it joined Kostroma and Nizhny Novgorod provinces, and its center was situated in the ancient, slow-moving village of Kadi. New leaders were sent there from various localities, and they made one another's acquaintance right in Kadi. There they found a remote, sad, impoverished region, badly in need of money, machines, and intelligent economic management, but instead starved by grain procurements. It happened that Fyodor Ivanovich Smirnov, the first secretary of the district party committee, was a man with a strong sense of justice. Stavrov, the head of the district agricultural department, was a peasant through and through, one of those peasants known as the intensivniki, in other words, the hard-working, zealous, and literate peasants who in the 20s had run their farms on a scientific basis, for which they were at that time rewarded by the Soviet government, since it had not yet been decided that all these intensivniki must be destroyed. Because Stavrov had entered the party, he had survived the liquidation of the kulaks, and maybe he even took part in the liquidation of the kulaks. These men tried to do something for the peasants in their new district, but directives kept pouring down from above, and each one ran counter to some initiative of theirs. It was as if, up there, they were busy thinking up what they could do to make things worse and more desperate for the peasants. And at one point, the leaders in Kadi wrote the province leadership that it was necessary to lower the plan for procurement of bread grains, because the district couldn't fulfill the plan without becoming impoverished well below the danger point. One has to recall the situation in the 30s, and maybe not only the 30s, to realize what sacrilege against the plan and what rebellion against the government this represented. But in accordance with then current style, measures were not taken directly from above, but were left to local initiative. When Smirnov was on vacation, his deputy, Vasily Fyodorovich Romanov, the second secretary, arranged to have a resolution passed by the district party committee. The successes of the district would have been even more brilliant if it were not for the Trotskyite Stavrov. This set in motion the individual case of Stavrov. An interesting approach, divide and rule. For the time being, Smirnov was merely to be frightened, neutralized, and compelled to retreat. There would be time enough later on to get to him. And this, on a small scale, was precisely the Stalinist tactic in the Central Committee. At stormy party meetings, however, it became clear that Stavrov was about as much of a Trotskyite as he was a Jesuit. The head of the district consumer cooperatives, Vasily Grigorievich Vlasov, a man with a ragtag, haphazard education, but one of those native talents others are so surprised to find among Russians, a born retail trade executive, eloquent, adroit in an argument, who could get fired to red heat about anything he believed to be right, tried to persuade the party meeting to expel Romanov from the party for slander. And they actually did give Romanov an official party rebuke. Romanov's last words in this dispute were typical of this kind of person, demonstrating his assurance in regard to the general situation. Even though they proved Stavrov was not a Trotskyite, nonetheless I am sure he is a Trotskyite. The party will investigate,
and it will also investigate the rebuke to me." And the party did investigate. The district NKVD arrested Stavrov almost immediately, and 1 month later they also arrested Univer, the chairman of the district executive committee, and an Estonian. And Romanov took over Univer's job as chairman of the district executive committee. Stavrov was taken to the provincial NKVD, where he confessed he was a Trotskyite, that he had acted in coalition with the SRs all his life, that he was a member of an underground rightist organization in his district. This is a bouquet worthy of the times, the only thing missing being a connection with the Entente. Perhaps he never really did confess these things, but no one is ever going to know, since he died from torture during interrogation in the internal prison of the Ivanovo NKVD. The pages of his deposition were there in full. Soon afterward they arrested Smirnov, the secretary of the district party committee, as the head of the supposed rightist organization, and Sabirov, the head of the district financial department, and someone else as well. Of interest is the way in which Vlasov's fate was decided. He had only recently demanded the expulsion from the party of Romanov, now the new chairman of the district executive committee. He had also fatally offended Rusov, the district prosecutor, as we have already reported in Chapter 4 above. He had offended N.I. Krylov, the chairman of the district NKVD, by protecting 2 of his energetic and resourceful executives from being arrested for supposed wrecking. Both of them had black marks on their records because of their social origins. Vlasov always hired all kinds of former people for his work, because they mastered the business effectively, and in addition tried hard. People promoted from the ranks of the proletariat knew nothing, and more importantly, didn't want to know anything. Nonetheless, the NKVD was prepared to make its peace with the trade cooperative. Sorokin, the deputy chairman of the district NKVD, came in person to see Vlasov with a peace proposal: to give the NKVD 700 rubles worth of materials without charging them for it, and later on we will somehow write it off. The rag pickers, and that was 2 months' wages for Vlasov, who had never taken anything illegally for himself. "And if you don't give it to us, you are going to regret it." Vlasov kicked him out. "How do you dare offer me, a communist, a deal like that?" The very next day, Krylov paid a call on the district consumer cooperative, this time as the representative of the district committee of the party. This masquerade, like all these tricks, was in the spirit of 1937. And this time he ordered the convening of a party meeting. The agenda: on the wrecking activities of Smirnov and Univer in the consumers' cooperatives. The report to be delivered by Comrade Vlasov. Well, now that's a gem of a trick for you. No one at that point was making charges against Vlasov, but it would be quite enough for him to say 2 little words about the wrecking activities of the former secretary of the district party committee in his, Vlasov's, field, and the NKVD would interrupt: "And where were you? Why didn't you come to us in time?" In a situation of this sort, many others would have lost their heads and allowed themselves to be trapped, but not Vlasov. He immediately replied: "I won't make the report. Let Krylov make the report. After all, he arrested Smirnov and Univer and is handling their case." Krylov refused. "I'm not familiar with the evidence." Vlasov replied: "If even you aren't familiar with the evidence, that means they were arrested without cause." So the party meeting simply didn't take place. But how often did people dare to defend themselves? We will not have a complete picture of the atmosphere of 1937 if we lose sight of the fact that there were still strong-willed people capable of difficult decisions, and if we fail to recall that late that night T, the senior bookkeeper of the district consumer cooperative, and his deputy N came to Vlasov's office with 10,000 rubles. "Vasily Grigorievich, get out of town tonight. Don't wait for tomorrow. Otherwise you are finished." But Vlasov thought it did not befit a communist to run away. The next morning, there was a nasty article in the district paper on the work of the district consumer cooperative. One has to point out that in 1937 the press always played hand in glove with the NKVD. By evening,
Vlasov had been asked to give the district party committee an accounting of his own work. Every step of the way, this was how things were in the entire Soviet Union. This was 1937, the second year of the so-called Mikoyan prosperity in Moscow and other big cities. And even today, in the reminiscences of journalists and writers, one gets the impression that at the time there was already plenty of everything. This concept seems to have gone down in history, and there is a danger of it staying there. And yet, in November 1936, 2 years after the abolition of bread rationing, a secret directive was published in Ivanovo province, and in other provinces, prohibiting the sale of flour. In those years, many housewives in small towns, and particularly in villages, still used to bake their own bread. Prohibiting the sale of flour meant, do not eat bread. In the district center of Kadi, long bread lines formed such as had never before been seen. However, they attacked that problem, too, by forbidding the baking of black bread in district centers, permitting only expensive white bread to be baked. The only bakery in the whole Kadi district was the one in the district center, and people began to pour into the center from the villages to get black bread. The warehouses of the district consumer cooperative had flour, but the 2 parallel prohibitions blocked off all avenues by which it could be made available to the public. Vlasov, however, managed to find a way out of the impasse, and despite the clever government rulings, he kept the district fed for a whole year. He went out to the collective farms and got 8 of them to agree to set up public bakeries in empty kulak huts. In other words, they would simply bring in firewood and set the women to baking in ordinary Russian peasant ovens, but mind you, ovens which were now socialized, publicly, not privately owned. The district consumer cooperative would undertake to supply them with flour. There is eternal simplicity to a solution once it has been discovered. Without building any bakeries, for which he had no funds, Vlasov set them up in one day. Without carrying on a trade in flour, he released flour from the warehouse continuously and proceeded to order more from the provincial center. Without selling black bread in the district center, he gave the district black bread. Yes, he did not violate the letter of the instructions, but he violated their spirit, for their essence was to compel a reduction in flour consumption by starving the people. And so, of course, there were good grounds for criticizing him at the district party committee. After that criticism, he remained free overnight and was arrested the next morning. He was a tough little bantam rooster. He was short, and he always carried his head slightly thrown back, with a touch of aggressiveness. He tried to avoid surrendering his party membership card, because no decision expelling him from the party had been reached at the district party committee the night before. He also refused to give up his identification card as a deputy of the district Soviet, since he had been elected by the people, and the district executive committee had not taken any decision depriving him of his deputy's immunity. But the police did not appreciate such formalities, and overpowered him and took them away by main force. They took him from the district consumer cooperative down the main street of Kadi in broad daylight, and his young merchandise manager, a Komsomol member, saw him from the window of the district party committee headquarters. At that time, not everyone, especially in the villages, because of the naivety, had learned to keep quiet about what they thought. The merchandise manager shouted, "Look at those bastards! Now they've taken away my boss, too!" Right then and there, without leaving the room, they expelled him from both the district party committee and from the Komsomol, and he slid down the well-known pathway into the bottomless pit. Vlasov was arrested very late in comparison with the others who were charged in the same case. The case had been nearly completed without him, and it was in process of being set up as an open trial. They took him to the Ivanovo NKVD internal prison, but since he was the last to be involved, he was not subjected to any heavy pressure. He was interrogated twice, there was no supporting testimony from witnesses, and the file of his interrogation was filled with summary reports of the district consumer cooperative and clips from the district newspaper. Vlasov was charged with 1. Initiating bread lines, 2. having an inadequate minimum assortment of merchandise, just as though the unavailable merchandise existed somewhere else and someone had offered it to Kadi. 3. Procuring a surplus of salt. But this was the obligatory mobilization reserve. Ever since ancient times, people in Russia have been afraid of being without salt in the event of war. At the end of September, the defendants were brought to Kadi for public trial. It was not a short trip. Remember how cheap the OSOs and the closed courts were. From Ivanovo to Kineshma, they went in a Stolypin railway car, then 70 miles from Kineshma to Kadi in automobiles. There were more than 10 cars, an unusual file along an old, deserted road, and one that aroused astonishment, fear, and the expectation of war in the villages. Klyugin, the chief of the Special Secret Department of the provincial NKVD for counter-revolutionary organizations, was responsible for the faultless organization of the whole trial, and for terrifying the public with it. Their convoy consisted of 40 guards from the reserves of the mounted police, and every day from September the 24th to the 27th, with swords unsheathed and Naguan revolvers at the ready, they took the prisoners from the district NKVD to the still unfinished club building and back, through the village where they had until recently been the government. Windows had already been installed in the club, but the stage had not yet been finished. There was no electricity. There was no electricity in Kadi at all. After nightfall, the court met by the light of kerosene lamps. The spectators were brought in from the collective farms in rotation, and all Kadi crowded in as well. Not only did they sit on windowsills and benches, but they stood packed in the aisles, 700 of them at a time. Russians have always loved spectacles. The forward benches were regularly reserved for communists to provide the court with dependable support. A special assize of the provincial court had been constituted, consisting of deputy chairman of the provincial court Shubin, who presided, and members Bicha and Zaodzerov. The provincial prosecutor Karasik, a graduate of Dorpat University, was in charge of the prosecution. And even though all the accused declined defense lawyers, a government lawyer was forced on them so that the case wouldn't be left without a prosecutor. The formal indictment, solemn, menacing, and lengthy, came down in essence to the charge that an underground rightist Bukharinite group had existed in Kadi district, which had been formed in Ivanovo, in other words, you could expect arrests in Ivanovo too, and had as its purpose the overthrow by wrecking of the Soviet government in the village of Kadi, and this was about the remotest boondock in all Russia the rightists could have found for a starting point. The prosecutor petitioned the court to have Stavrov's testimony, given before his death in prison, read to the court and accepted as evidence. In fact, the whole charge against the group was based on Stavrov's evidence. The court agreed to include the testimony of the deceased, just as if he were alive, with the advantage, however, that none of the defendants could refute it. But darkest Kadi did not appreciate these scholarly fine points. It waited to see what came next. The testimony of Stavrov, who had been killed under interrogation, was read to the court and once again became part of the record. The questioning of the defendants began, and immediately there was chaos. All of them repudiated the testimony they had given during the interrogation. It is not clear how, in such an event, things would have been arranged in the October Hall of the House of the Unions in Moscow, but here at any rate it was decided shamelessly to continue. The judge rebuked the defendants. How could you have given different testimony during the interrogation? Univer, very weak, replied in a barely audible voice, As a communist, I cannot, in a public trial, describe the interrogation methods of the NKVD. Now there was a model for the Bukharin trial. Now that's what keeps them together. More than anything else, they are worried that people might think ill of the party. Their judges had long since stopped worrying about that. During the recess, Klyugin visited the cells of the defendants. He said to Vlasov, You've heard how Smirnov and Univer played the whore, the bastards. You've got to admit your guilt and tell the whole truth. The truth and nothing but the truth, willingly agreed Vlasov, who had not yet weakened. The truth and nothing but the truth, that you are every bit as bad as the German fascists. Kryugin flew into a rage. Listen here, you whore, you'll pay with your blood. Your own blood, too, is going to flow soon, Kryugin. Caught in the Yezhov gang of Gaybisti, Kryugin will have his throat cut by the stool pigeon Gubaidulin. From that moment, Vlasov was pushed forward from a back seat among the dependents to a leading role in the trial, as the ideological leader of the group. The crowd jamming the aisles grew interested whenever the court fearlessly broke into questions about bread lines, about things that touched everyone present to the quick. And, of course, bread had been put on unrestricted sale just before the trial, and there were no bread lines that day. The question to the accused Smirnov. Did you know about the bread lines in the district? Yes, of course. They stretched from the store itself right up to the building of the district party committee. And what did you do about them? Notwithstanding the tortures he had endured, Smirnov had preserved his resounding voice and tranquil righteousness. This broad-shouldered man with a simple face and light brown hair answered slowly, and the whole hall heard every word he said. Since all appeals to organizations in the provincial capital had failed, I instructed Vlasov to write a report to Comrade Stalin. And why didn't you write it? They hadn't yet known about it. They had certainly missed that one. We did write it, and I sent it by courier directly to the Central Committee, bypassing the provincial leaders. A copy was kept in the district committee files. The whole courtroom held its breath. The court itself was in a commotion. They shouldn't have continued questioning, but nonetheless someone asked, "And what happened?" And indeed, that question was on the lips of everyone in the courtroom. What happened? Smirnov did not sob, did not groan over the death of his ideal, and that's what was missing in the Moscow trials. He replied loudly and calmly, "Nothing. There was no answer." And his tired voice seemed to say, "Well, that, in fact, was just what I expected." There was no answer. From the father and teacher, there was no answer. The public trial had already reached its zenith. It had already shown the masses the black heart of the cannibal, and the trial could have been called off right then and there. But oh no, they didn't have sense enough for that, or tact enough for that, and they kept rubbing away at the befouled spot for 3 more days. The prosecutor raised a hue and cry. Double dealing, that's what it was. They engaged in wrecking with one hand, and with the other they dared write Comrade Stalin. And they even expected a reply from him. Let the defendant Vlasov tell us how he pulled off such a nightmarish piece of wrecking that he stopped the sale of flour and the baking of rye bread in the district center. Vlasov, the bantam rooster, didn't have to be asked to rise. He had already jumped up, and he shouted resoundingly through the hall, "I agree to give a full answer to the court, but on condition that you, the prosecutor, Karasik, leave the accuser's rostrum and sit down here next to me." It was incomprehensible. Noise, shouting, call them to order. What was going on? Having gotten the floor with this maneuver, Vlasov explained willingly. The prohibitions on selling flour and baking rye bread were instituted by a decree of the Provincial Executive Committee. One of the permanent members of its presidium is Provincial Prosecutor Karasik. If that's wrecking, then why didn't you veto it as prosecutor? That means you were a wrecker even before I was. The prosecutor choked. It was a swift, well-placed blow. The court was also at a loss. The judge mumbled. "If necessary, we will try the prosecutor too, but today we are trying you." 2 truths. It all depends on your rank. "I demand that he be removed from the prosecutor's rostrum," insisted the indefatigable, irrepressible Vlasov. Recess. Now, in terms of indoctrinating the masses, just what significance could such a trial have? But they kept on and on. After questioning the defendants, they began to question the witnesses. The bookkeeper, N. "What do you know about Vlasov's wrecking activities?" "Nothing." "How can that be? I was in the witnesses' room and I didn't hear what was said in here." "You don't have to hear. Many documents passed through your hands. You couldn't help but know." The documents were all in proper order. But here is a stack of district newspapers, and even there they were writing about Vlasov's wrecking activities, and you claim you don't know anything? Well, go ask the people who wrote the articles. Then there was the manager of the bread store. Tell me, does the Soviet government have much bread? Well, now, just how could you answer that? Who was going to say, I didn't count it? A lot. Why are there bread lines at your store? I don't know. Who was in charge? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Who was in charge of your store? Vasily Grigorievich. What the devil? What do you mean, calling him Vasily Grigorievich? Defendant Vlasov. That means he was in charge. The witness fell silent. The judge of the court dictated to the stenographer, the answer, as a consequence of the wrecking activity of Vlasov, bread lines resulted, notwithstanding the Soviet government's enormous stocks of bread. Repressing his own fears, the prosecutor delivered a long and angry speech. The defense lawyer, for the most part, defended only himself, emphasizing that the interests of the motherland were as dear to him as they were to any honest citizen. In his final words to the court, Smirnov asked for nothing and expressed no repentance for anything. Insofar as we can reconstruct it now, he was a firm person and too forthright to have lasted through 1937. When Saburov begged that his life be spared, not for me, but for my little children, Vlasov, out of vexation, pulled him back by the jacket. You're a fool! Vlasov himself did not fail to take advantage of his last chance to talk back impudently. I consider you not a court, but actors pretending to be a court in a stage farce where roles have already been written for you. You are engaged in a repulsive provocation on the part of the NKVD. You are going to sentence me to be shot no matter what I say. I believe one thing only. The time will come when you will be here in my place. Generally speaking, he was wrong just on this one point. The court spent from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. composing the verdict, and all the while the kerosene lamps were burning in the hall, and the defendants sat beneath drawn sabres, and there was a hum of conversation among the spectators who had not left. And just as it took them a long time to compose the verdict, it took them a long time to read it, piling up on top of one another all kinds of fantastic wrecking activities, contacts, and plans. Smirnov, Univer, Saburov, and Vlasov were sentenced to be shot. 2 others to 10 years, 1 to 8 years. In addition, the verdict of the court led to the exposure of an additional wrecking organization in the Komsomol in Kadi, whose members were, of course, immediately arrested. Remember the young merchandise manager? And of a center of underground organizations in Ivanovo, which was, of course, in its turn subordinate to Moscow. One more nail in Bukharin's coffin. After the solemn words, to be shot, the judges paused for applause, but the mood in the hall was so gloomy, with the sighs and tears of people who had no connection with the defendants, and the screams and swooning of their relatives, that no applause was to be heard even from the first 2 benches where the party members were sitting. This, indeed, was totally improper. "Oh, good Lord, what have you done?" someone in the hall shouted at the members of the court. Univer's wife dissolved in tears. In the half-darkness, the crowd began to stir. Vlasov shouted at the front benches, "Come on, you bastards! Why aren't you clapping? Some communists you are!" The political commissar of the guards platoon ran up to him and shoved his revolver in his face. Vlasov reached out to grab the revolver, but a policeman ran up and pushed back his political commissar, who had been guilty of a blunder. The chief of the convoy gave the command, "Arms at the ready!" And 30 police carbines and the pistols of the local NKVD men were aimed at the defendants and at the crowd. It seemed at the time as though the crowd would rush forward to free the defendants. The hall was lit only by a few kerosene lamps, and the semi-darkness heightened the general confusion and fear. The crowd, finally convinced, not so much by the trial as by the carbines now leveled at it, pushed in a panic against the doors and windows. The wood cracked and broke, glass tinkled. Univer's wife, in a dead faint, was almost trampled to death and was left lying beneath the chairs until morning. And there never was any applause. One
little note on 8-year-old Zoya Vlasova. She loved her father intensely. She could no longer go to school. They teased her, "Your papa is a wrecker." She would get in a fight. "My papa is good." She lived only 1 year after the trial. After then, she had never been ill. During that year, she did not once smile. She went about with head hung low, and the old women prophesied, "She keeps looking at the earth. She is going to die soon." She died of inflammation of the brain, and as she was dying, she kept calling out, "Where is my papa? Give me my papa." When we count up the millions of those who perished in the camps, we forget to multiply them by 2, by 3. And not only couldn't the condemned prisoners be shot then and there, but they had to be kept under even stricter guard, because now they really had nothing at all to lose, and they had to be taken to the provincial capital for execution. They managed to cope with the first problem, sending them off by night to the NKVD along the main street, by having each condemned man guarded by 5 men. One of the guards carried a lantern. One went ahead with a pistol at the ready. 2 held the condemned prisoner by the arms and kept their pistols in their free hands. The 5th brought up the rear, with his pistol pointed at the condemned man's back. The rest of the police were ranged in formation in order to prevent any attack by the crowd. Every reasonable man will now agree that the NKVD could never have carried out its great assignment if they had fussed about with open trials, and that is why public political trials never really put down roots in our country. Chapter 11. The Supreme Measure. Capital punishment has had an up-and-down history in Russia. In the code of the Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov, there were 50 crimes for which capital punishment could be imposed. By the time of the military statutes of Peter the Great, there were 200. Yet the Empress Elizabeth, while she did not repeal those laws authorizing capital punishment, never once resorted to it. They say that when she ascended the throne, she swore on oath never to execute anyone, and for all 20 years of her reign she kept that oath. She fought the 7 Years' War, yet she still got along without capital punishment. It was an astounding record in the mid-18th century, 50 years before the guillotine of the Jacobins. True, we have taught ourselves to ridicule all our past. We never acknowledge a good deed or a good intention in our history, and one can very easily blacken Elizabeth's reputation, too. She replaced capital punishment with flogging with the knout, tearing out nostrils, branding with the word thief, and eternal exile in Siberia. But let us also say something on behalf of the Empress. How could she have changed things more radically than she did in contravention of the social concepts of her time? And perhaps the prisoner condemned to death today would voluntarily consent to that whole complex of punishments, if only the sun would continue to shine on him. But we, in our humanitarianism, don't offer him that chance. And perhaps the reader will come to feel in the course of this book that 20 or even 10 years in our camps are harder to bear than were the punishments of Elizabeth. In today's terms, Elizabeth had a universally human point of view on all this, while the Empress Catherine the Great had, on the contrary, a class point of view, which was consequently more correct. Not to execute anyone at all seemed to her appalling and indefensible. She found capital punishment entirely appropriate to defending herself, her throne, and her system. In other words, in political cases such as those of Mirovich, the Moscow Plague Mutiny, and Pugachev. But for habitual criminals, for non-political offenders, why not consider capital punishment abolished? Under Paul, the abolition of capital punishment was confirmed. Despite his many wars, there were no military tribunals attached to military units. And during the whole long reign of Alexander I, capital punishment was introduced only for war crimes that took place during a campaign, 1812. Right at this point, some people will say to us, what about deaths from running the gauntlet? Yes, indeed, there were, of course, hidden executions. For that matter, one can literally drive a person to death with a trade union meeting. But the yielding up of one's God-given life because others, sitting in judgment, have so voted simply did not take place in our country,
even for crimes of state, for an entire half-century, from Pugachev to the Decembrists. The blood of the 5 Decembrists whetted the appetite of our state. From then on, execution for crimes of state was no longer prohibited, nor was it forgotten, right up to the February Revolution in 1917. It was confirmed by the statutes of 1845 and 1904, and further reinforced by the criminal statutes of the Army and Navy. And how many people were executed in Russia during that period? We have already, in Chapter 8 above, cited the figures given by liberal leaders of 1905 to 1907. Let us add to them the verified figures of N.S. Tagantsev, the expert on Russian criminal law. Up until 1905, the death penalty was an exceptional measure in Russia. For a period of 30 years, from 1876 to 1904, the period of the Narodnaya Volya revolutionaries and the use of terrorism, a terrorism which did not consist merely of intentions murmured in the kitchen of a communal apartment, a period of mass strikes and peasant revolts, the period when the parties of the future revolution were created and grew in strength. 486 people were executed. In other words, about 17 people per year for the whole country. This figure includes executions of ordinary, non-political criminals. 13 people were executed in Schlüsselburg from 1884 to 1906, an awesome total for Switzerland, perhaps. During the years of the First Revolution, 1905, and its suppression, the number of executions rocketed upward, astounding Russian imaginations, calling forth tears from Tolstoy and indignation from Korolenko and many, many others. From 1905 through 1908, about 2,200 persons were executed, 45 a month. This, as Tagantsev said, was an epidemic of executions. It came to an abrupt end. When the provisional government came to power, it abolished capital punishment entirely. In July 1917, however, it was reinstated in the active army and front-line areas for military crimes, murder, rape, assault, and pillage, very widespread in those areas at that time. This was one of the most unpopular of the measures which destroyed the provisional government. The Bolshevik slogan before the Bolshevik coup d'etat was, "Down with capital punishment, reinstated by Kerensky." A story has come down to us that on the night of October the 25th to 26th, a discussion arose in Smolny as to whether one of the first decrees shouldn't be the abolition of capital punishment in perpetuity, whereupon Lenin justly ridiculed the idealism of his comrades. He, at any rate, knew that without capital punishment there would be no movement whatever in the direction of the new society. However, in forming a coalition government with the left SRs, he gave in to their faulty concepts, and on October the 28th, 1917, capital punishment was abolished. Nothing good, of course, could come from that goody-goody position. Yes, and how did they get rid of it? At the beginning of 1918, Trotsky ordered that Alexei Shastny, a newly appointed admiral, be brought to trial because he had refused to scuttle the Baltic fleet. Karklin, the chairman of the Vertrib, quickly sentenced him in broken Russian to be shot within 24 hours. There was a stir in the hall. But it has been abolished. Prosecutor Krylenko explained. What are you worrying about? Executions have been abolished. But Shastny is not being executed. He is being shot. And they did shoot him. If we are to judge by official documents, capital punishment was restored in all its force in June 1918. No, it was not restored. Instead, a new era of executions was inaugurated. If one takes the view that Latsis is not deliberately understating the real figures, but simply lacks complete information, and that the Rev tribunals carried on approximately the same amount of judicial work as the Cheka performed in an extrajudicial way, one concludes that in the 20 central provinces of Russia in a period of 16 months, June 1918 to October 1919, more than 16,000 persons were shot, which is to say more than 1,000 a month. Now that we have started to make comparisons, here is another. During the 80 years of the Inquisition's peak effort, 1420 to 1498, in all of Spain, 10,000 persons were condemned to be burned to death at the stake. In other words, about 10 a month. This, incidentally, is when they shot both Krustalev Nosar, the chairman of the 1905 St. Petersburg Soviet, the first Russian Soviet, and the artist who designed the legendary uniform worn by the Red Army throughout the Civil War.
However, it may not even have been these individual executions, with or without formally pronounced death sentences, which added up to thousands and inaugurated the new era of executions in 1918 that stunned and froze Russia.
Still more terrible to us was the practice, initially followed by both warring sides and later by the victors only, of sinking barges loaded with uncounted, unregistered hundreds, unidentified even by a roll call. Naval officers in the Gulf of Finland, in the White, Caspian, and Black Seas, and as late as 1920, hostages in Lake Baikal. This is outside the scope of our narrow history of courts and trials, but it belongs to the history of morals, which is where everything else originates as well. In all our centuries, from the first Ryurik on, had there ever been a period of such cruelties and so much killing as during the post-October Civil War? We would omit from view one of the characteristic ups and downs of the Russian capital punishment story if we neglected to mention that capital punishment was abolished in January 1920.
This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 5, Side 2.
We would omit from view one of the characteristic ups and downs of the Russian capital punishment story if we neglected to mention that capital punishment was abolished in January 1920. Yes, indeed. And some students of the subject might conceivably be at a loss to interpret the credulity and helplessness of a dictatorship that deprived itself of its avenging sword when Denikin was still in the Kuban, Wrangel still in the Crimea, and the Polish cavalry were saddling up for a campaign. But in the first place, this decree was quite sensible. It did not extend to the decisions of military tribunals, but applied only to extrajudicial actions of the Cheka and the decisions of tribunals in the rear. In the second place, the way was prepared for it by first cleaning out the prisons by the wholesale execution of prisoners who otherwise might have come under the decree. And in the third place, it was in effect for a brief period, 4 months. It lasted only until the prisons had filled up again. By a decree of May the 28th, 1920, capital punishment was restored to the Cheka. The revolution had hastened to rename everything so that everything would seem new. Thus, the death penalty was rechristened the supreme measure, no longer a punishment, but a means of social defense. From the groundwork of the criminal legislation of 1924, it is clear that the supreme measure was introduced only temporarily, pending its total abolition by the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. And in 1927 they actually did begin to abolish it. It was retained solely for crimes against the state and the army, Article 58, and military crimes, and true for banditry also. But the broad political interpretation of banditry was as well known then as it is now, from a Central Asian basmach right up to a Lithuanian forest guerrilla. Every armed nationalist who doesn't agree with the central government is a bandit, and how could one possibly get along without that article? Similarly, any participant in a camp rebellion and any participant in an urban rebellion is also a bandit. But where articles protecting private individuals were concerned, capital punishment was abolished to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Revolution. And for the 15th anniversary, the law of 7/8 was added to the roster of capital punishment, that law so vitally important to advancing socialism, which guaranteed the Soviet subject a bullet for each crumb stolen from the state's table. As always happens at the start, they hurried to apply this law in 1932 to 1933 and shot people with special ferocity. In this time of peace, in December 1932, while Kirov was still alive, at one time 265 condemned prisoners were awaiting execution in Leningrad's Kresty prison alone. Testimony of B, who brought food to the cells of the prisoners condemned to be shot. And during the whole year, it would certainly seem that more than 1,000 were shot in Kresty alone. And what kind of evildoers were these condemned men? Where did so many plotters and troublemakers come from? Among them, for example, were 6 collective farmers from nearby Tsarskoye Selo, who were guilty of the following crime. After they had finished mowing the collective farm with their own hands, they had gone back and mowed a second time along the hummocks to get a little hay for their own cows. The All-Russian Central Executive Committee refused to pardon all 6 of these peasants, and the sentence of execution was carried out. What cruel and evil Solzhenitsyn, what utterly repulsive and infamous serf owner would have killed 6 peasants for their miserable little clippings of hay? If one had dared to beat them with birch switches even once, we would know about it and read about it in school and curse that name. What isn't known in our schools is the fact that Solzhenitsyn, by a verdict of her own peers, was imprisoned for 11 years in the subterranean crypt of the Ivanovsky Monastery in Moscow for the atrocities inflicted on her serfs. But now, heave the corpses into the water, and pretty soon the surface is all smooth again, and no one's the wiser. And one must cherish the hope that someday documents will confirm the report of my witness, who is still alive. Even if Stalin had killed no others, I believe he deserved to be drawn and quartered just for the lives of those 6 Tsarskoye Selo peasants. And yet they still dare shriek at us, from Peking, from Tirana, from Tbilisi, yes, and plenty of big bellies in the Moscow suburbs are doing it too. How could you dare expose him? How could you dare disturb his great shade? Stalin belongs to the world communist movement. But in my opinion, all he belongs to is the criminal code. The peoples of all the world remember him as a friend, but not those on whose backs he rode, whom he slashed with his knout. However, let us return to being dispassionate and impartial once more. Of course, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee would certainly have completely abolished the supreme measure, as promised. But unfortunately what happened was that in 1936 the father and teacher completely abolished the All-Russian Central Executive Committee itself, and the Supreme Soviet that succeeded it had an 18th century ring. The supreme measure became a punishment once again, and ceased to be some kind of incomprehensible social defense. Even to the Stalinist ear, the executions of 1937 to 1938 could hardly fit into any framework of defense. What legal expert, what criminal historian, will provide us with verified statistics for those 1937 to 1938 executions? Where is that special archive we might be able to penetrate in order to read the figures? There is none. There is none, and there never will be any. Therefore, we dare report only those figures mentioned in rumors that were quite fresh in 1939 to 1940, when they were drifting around under the Butyrki arches, having emanated from the high and the middle-ranking Yezhov men of the NKVD, who had been arrested and had passed through those cells not long before. And they really knew. The Yezhov men said that during those 2 years of 1937 and 1938, 500,000 political prisoners had been shot throughout the Soviet Union, and 480,000 blatnie, habitual thieves, in addition. The thieves were all shot under Article 59.3, because they constituted a basis of Yagoda's power, and thereby the ancient and noble companionship of thieves was pruned back. How improbable are these figures, taking into consideration that the mass executions went on not for 2 full years, but only for a year and a half? We would have to assume, under Article 58, in other words, the politicals alone, an average of 28,000 executions per month in that period, for the whole Soviet Union. But at how many different locations were executions being carried out? A figure of 150 would be very modest. There were more, of course. In Pskov alone, the NKVD set up torture and execution chambers in the basements of many churches, in former hermits' cells. And even in 1953, tourists were still not allowed into these churches on the grounds that archives were kept there. The cobwebs hadn't been swept out for 10 years at a stretch. Those were the archives they kept there. And before beginning restoration work on these churches, they had to haul away the bones in them by the truckload. On the basis of this calculation, an average of 6 people were shot in the course of 1 day at each execution site. What's so fantastic about that? It is even an understatement. According to other sources, 1,700,000 had been shot by January the 1st, 1939. During the years of World War II, the use of capital punishment was occasionally extended for various reasons, as, for example, by the militarization of the railroads, and at times was broadened as to method, from April 1943 on, for example, with a decree on hanging. All these events delayed to a certain extent the promised full, final, and perpetual repeal of the death penalty. However, the patience and loyalty of our people finally earned them this reward. In May 1947, Yosif Vissarionovich inspected his new starched dicky in his mirror, liked it, and dictated to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet the decree on the abolition of capital punishment in peacetime, replacing it with a new maximum term of 25 years. It was a good pretext for introducing the so-called quarter. But our people are ungrateful, criminal, and incapable of appreciating generosity. Therefore, after the rulers had creaked along and eked out 2.5 years without the death penalty, on January the 12th, 1950, a new decree was published that constituted an about-face. In view of petitions pouring in from the national republics, the Ukraine, from the trade unions, oh, those lovely trade unions, they always know what's needed, from peasant organizations, this was dictated by a sleepwalker. The gracious sovereign had stomped to death all peasant organizations way back in the year of the great turning point. And also from cultural leaders. Now that is quite likely. Capital punishment was restored for a conglomeration of traitors of the motherland, spies, and subversives, diversionists. And of course they forgot to repeal the quarter, the 25-year sentence, which remained in force. And once this return to our familiar friend, to our beheading blade, had begun, things went further with no effort at all. In 1954, for premeditated murder, in May 1961, for theft of state property and counterfeiting and terrorism in places of imprisonment. This was directed especially at prisoners who killed informers and terrorized the camp administration. In July 1961, for violating the rules governing foreign currency transactions. In February 1962, for threatening the lives of, shaking a fist at, policemen or communist vigilantes, the so-called drozhiniki, then for rape, and immediately thereafter for bribery. But all of this is simply temporary until complete abolition. And that's how it's described today, too. And so it turns out that Russia managed longest of all without capital punishment in the reign of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. In our happy, blind existence, we picture condemned men as a few ill-fated, solitary individuals. We instinctively believe that we could never end up on death row, that it would take an outstanding career, if not heinous guilt, for that to happen. A great deal is still to be shaken up inside our heads for us to get the real picture. A mass of the most ordinary, average, grey people have languished in death cells for the most ordinary, everyday misdemeanors, and although some were lucky and had their death sentences commuted, which was purely a matter of chance, they very often got the super, which is what the prisoners called the supreme measure, since they hate lofty words and manage somehow to give everything a nickname that is both crude and short. The agronomist of a district agricultural department got a death sentence for his mistaken analysis of collective farm grain. Maybe it was because his analysis wasn't what his chiefs wanted from him. That was in 1937. Melnikov, the chairman of a handicraft artel that made spools for thread, was sentenced to death because a spark from a steam engine in his artel had caused a fire. That was in 1937. True, his death sentence was commuted to a tenner. In that same Kresty prison in Leningrad in 1932, 2 of the men in death cells were Feldman, convicted of possessing foreign currency, and Feitelevich, a student at the conservatory, for having sold steel ribbon for pen points. Primordial commerce, the bread and butter and pastime of the Jew, had also become worthy of the death penalty. Ought we to be surprised, then, that the Ivanovo province village lad Geraska got the death penalty? In honor of the spring St. Nicholas holiday, he went off to the next village to celebrate. He drank heavily, and with a stick he hit the rear end, no, not of the policeman himself, but of the policeman's horse. True, in a rage at the police, he ripped a piece of board off the village Soviet building, and then yanked out the village Soviet telephone by the cord, shouting, "Smash the devils!" Whether our destiny holds a death cell in store for us is not determined by what we have done or not done. It is determined by the turn of a great wheel and the thrust of powerful external circumstances. For example, Leningrad was under siege and blockade, and what would its highest-ranking leader, Comrade Zhdanov, think if there were no executions among the cases in Leningrad state security during such difficult times? He would think the organs were lying down on the job, would he not? Were there not big underground plots directed from outside by the Germans to be discovered? Why were such plots discovered under Stalin in 1919 and not under Zhdanov in 1942? No sooner ordered than done. Several ramified plots were discovered. You were asleep in your unheated Leningrad room, and the sharp claws of the Black Hand were already hovering over you. And yet none of this depended on you. Notice was taken of a Lieutenant General Ignatovsky, whose windows looked out on the Neva. He had pulled out a white handkerchief to blow his nose. Aha! A signal! Furthermore, because Ignatovsky was an engineer, he liked to talk about machinery with the sailors. And that clinched it. Ignatovsky was arrested. The time for reckoning came. Come on now, name 40 members of your organization. He named them. And so, if you happened to be an usher at the Alexandrinsky Theater, your chances of being named as one of his particular 40 were minimal. But if you were a professor at the Technological Institute, there you were on that list. Once more, that accursed intelligentsia. So how could it depend on you? To be on such a list amounted to execution for each one. And so they shot all of them. But here is how Konstantin Ivanovich Strakovich, a very important Russian scientist in hydrodynamics, remained alive. Some even higher bigwigs in state security were dissatisfied because the list was too small and not enough people were being shot. Therefore, Strakovich was selected as a suitable center for uncovering a new organization. He was summoned by Captain Altshuler. "What's this all about? Did you rush to confess everything so that you'd get shot and thereby conceal the underground government? What was your role in it?" Thus, Strakovich found himself in a new round of interrogations while he remained on death row. He proposed that they consider him the underground Minister of Education. He wanted to get it over with as soon as possible. But that wasn't good enough for Altshuler. The interrogation continued, and by this time Ignatovsky's group was being executed. During one of the interrogation sessions, Strakovich got angry. It wasn't that he wanted to live, but that he was tired of dying, and more than anything else, the lies made him sick. And so, while he was being cross-questioned in the presence of some security police bigwig, he pounded on the table, "You are the ones who ought to be shot. I am not going to lie any longer. I take back all my testimony." And his outburst helped. Not only did they stop interrogating him, but they forgot about him in his death cell for a long time. In all probability, an outburst of desperation in the midst of general submissiveness will always help. Thus, many were shot. Thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands. We divide, we multiply, we sigh, we curse. But still and all, these are just numbers. They overwhelm the mind and then are easily forgotten. And if some day the relatives of those who had been shot were to send one publisher photographs of their executed kin, and an album of those photographs were to be published in several volumes, then just by leafing through them and looking into the extinguished eyes, we would learn much that would be valuable for the rest of our lives. Such reading, almost without words, would leave a deep mark on our hearts for all eternity. In one household I am familiar with, where some former Zeks live, the following ceremony takes place. On March the 5th, the day of the death of the head murderer, they spread out on the table all the photographs of those who were shot and those who died in camps that they have been able to collect, several dozens of them. And throughout the day solemnity reigns in the apartment, somewhat like that of a church, somewhat like that of a museum. There is funeral music. Friends come to visit, to look at the photographs, to keep silent, to listen, to talk softly together. And then they leave without saying goodbye. And that is how it ought to be everywhere. At least these deaths would have left a small scar on our hearts, so that they should not have died in vain. And I, too, have a few such chance photographs. Look at these, at least. Viktor Petrovich Pokrovsky, shot in Moscow in 1918. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a student, shot in Petrograd in 1918. Vasily Ivanovich Anichkov, shot in the Lubyanka in 1927. Alexander Andreevich Svechin, a professor of the General Staff, shot in 1935. Mikhail Alexandrovich Repomatsky, an agronomist, shot in Orel in 1938. Yelizaveta Yevgenyevna Anichkova, shot in a camp on the Yenisei in 1942. How does all that happen? What is it like for people to wait there? What do they feel? What do they think about? And what decisions do they come to? And what is it like when they are taken away? And what do they feel in their last moments? And how actually do they... The morbid desire to pierce that curtain is natural, even though it is, of course, never going to happen to any of us. And it is natural that those who have survived cannot tell us about the very end, because, after all, they were pardoned. What happens next is something the executioners know about, but the executioners are not about to talk. Take, for instance, that famous Uncle Lyosha in the Kresty prison in Leningrad, who twisted the prisoner's hands behind his back and put handcuffs on him, and then, if the prisoner shouted down the night-time corridor, "Farewell, brothers," crammed a rolled-up rag into his mouth. Just why should he tell you about it? He is probably still walking around Leningrad, well-dressed. But if you happen to run into him... All right, Lipov got 10 years.